dear viewers joining us across the world. It is a pleasure to welcome you at the Tallinn Winter School of Cyber Diplomacy. I am Heli-Dirma Klaar, Cyber Ambassador for Estonia, and I'm honored now to introduce His Excellency Jonatan Vseviov, Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, who will be offering a keynote address of the Winter School. Please, Jonatan.
Dear friends, hello, and welcome to Interrelation Tallinn. It is my pleasure to greet you all at the virtual Tallinn Winter School of Cyber Diplomacy. Whether you are a seasoned cyber diplomat or a budding expert, whether you work on these topics daily or are simply interested in the intersection of cybersecurity and international affairs, the Winter School is meant for everyone with curiosity for cyber diplomacy. There is no doubt that responsible state behavior and maintaining stability in cyberspace have become mainstream foreign policy topics. As our societies and economies become more and more intertwined with technology, it is clear that what happens in cyberspace does not simply stay in cyberspace. It can have a major impact on our daily lives and livelihoods. As the world continues its fight against the COVID pandemic, our reliance on technology has increased, but so has our vulnerability. At a time when our medical institutions should be focused on fighting the virus and vaccinating populations, malicious cyber actors have tried to benefit for their own gain. Let me be very clear. Any attacks against health services and vaccine producers are absolutely unacceptable. It is important that we hold these offenders responsible for their malicious behavior. But this does not apply exclusively to health services. Many of our everyday functions and operations have moved online. It is therefore all the more pressing that we protect our essential infrastructure from cyber threats. This is where cyber diplomacy comes in. While day-to-day cybersecurity relies on many national institutions and stakeholders, it would not be possible without a stable and secure cyberspace worldwide. This requires international cooperation and trust building between different international actors. Cyber diplomacy is a relatively new field in international affairs. As many of you know, Estonia itself is a country toughened by cyber conflict. When we were hit by extensive cyber attacks back in 2007, there were no international political mechanisms for raising the significance of these attacks, no ability for us to appeal for assistance from other states, or for condemning the attackers. Since 2007, we have worked hard to raise cybersecurity issues in the European Union, at NATO, the OSCE, the United Nations, and other international fora. By now, a number of countries have appointed their own cyber ambassadors and have specific departments within their ministries of foreign affairs dedicated to these very issues. You will hear from many such professionals at this year's Winter School. However, as with any new field, much of the important work that is being done might still feel relatively out of range for the wider diplomatic community. The aim of our Winter School is to shed light on the trailblazing and important work that has been done over the years, seek out further ways to implement it, and look ahead to the future. The United Nations member states have agreed years ago that existing international law also applies in cyberspace. We hold the strong view that existing international law provides comprehensive guidance for state behavior, regardless of the domain. By following this simple principle, the behavior of states in cyberspace can become more transparent and predictable. 2021 is a pivotal year for continuing global discussions on cybersecurity in the context of international peace and stability. Two important diplomatic discussions known as the Group of Governmental Experts, or the GGE, and the Open-Ended Working Group, or the OEWG, continue in the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, which deals with international security and threats to peace. It is essential that these groups deliver on their mandate and come out with a consensus report that builds on what has already been achieved. Estonia considers that a framework for cyber stability and conflict prevention has already been established by existing international law, by non-binding peacetime norms of responsible state behavior, as well as by confidence-building measures and capacity-building efforts. This framework has developed in the United Nations General Assembly First Committee and is reflected in the 2010, 2013, and 2015 consensus report of the previous groups of governmental experts. Implementing this framework on a regional and global level is a major goal for most countries, including for Estonia. It does not only suffice to discuss cyber stability. We need to focus on implementing what has already been agreed upon. That is why Estonia supports the idea for a program of action to advance responsible state behavior in cyberspace. This program of action, or POA as it is oftentimes called, would help to implement the existing cyber stability framework and make sure that global processes related to the use of ICT in the context of international security are results-driven and truly help to prevent conflict and build up cyber resilience across the world. We are still seeing disparities across nations in their resilience. As technology develops, so do the skills of cyber actors. To help close the gap, it is essential to support cyber capacity building measures and exchange best practices between countries on maintaining a free, open, and secure cyberspace that is respectful of human rights. Regional efforts will also be essential for conflict prevention and increasing transparency and predictability. We will be highlighting examples and best practices throughout the winter school. Dear friends, one important thread that runs through the whole of cyber diplomacy is the protection of digital freedoms. It is vital to ensure that human rights are protected in the digital era. You are able to watch our winter school online thanks to a global, open, free, and stable internet. But that does not mean that digital technologies cannot be weaponized against people and sometimes against entire populations. While digital technologies offer new ways to exercise human rights, we have also seen technology being used for online surveillance, censorship, and harassment. In some places, internet shutdowns are used to cut off the flow of information, drown out dissent, and prevent the world from seeing what is truly going on. Some recent examples include Belarus and Myanmar. Internet freedom, including the freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly, as well as privacy rights online, must go hand in hand with cyber capacity building. Respect for human rights and security online should be treated as complementary concepts. That is something that cyber diplomats must always consider, as they help to safeguard the freedoms that underpin our societies in their work. Importantly, the internet is not run by any one country or institution. It operates on the basis of a multi-stakeholder model. This includes the private sector, academia, as well as civil society, and is vital for ensuring the balance of powers. This model is the lifeblood of a global, open, secure, and stable internet. The complexity of technology is also what makes it sometimes difficult to catch malicious actors. Just like technology is intertwined with every layer of our society, so can cyber threats lie anywhere. Malicious actors in cyberspace can be state sponsors, they can be just cyber criminals working for personal gain, or they can be criminals sponsored by states. This can make it time-consuming to ascertain who is behind certain deeds. To ensure cyber stability and protect our citizens, countries also need to do more to fight cybercrime. The annual cost of cybercrime to the global economy in 2020 is estimated to be 5.5 trillion euros, double that of 2015. This represents the largest transfer of economic wealth in history. It is greater than the global drugs trade, for instance. Cybercrime does not know borders, so international cooperation is absolutely essential. One important way to do that is the Budapest Convention, the only binding international instrument on the issue of cybercrime. Many countries across the world have already joined it. I have spoken a great deal in this speech about the work that countries are doing and where they could do more. But what can citizens themselves do? It is important that we all become more aware of the cyber world, the possibilities as well as the threats that exist in the internet. We should look at technology with a discerning eye and make sure that while we enjoy its many benefits, our rights and data remain protected. We must look after cyber hygiene and urge others at work, school, and home to do the same. As diplomats, we can build the foundation, reach agreements between governments, and help to implement them, and work with other key stakeholders in the world to ensure accountability. As citizens, ensuring cyber stability and resilience is a much wider task. Dear friends, thank you so much for attending the Winter School, and welcome to virtual Tallinn. Please enjoy. Thank you.
Dear diplomats and cyber experts, when we held the first Tallinn Cyber School of Diplomacy back in 2019, we brought together over 80 diplomats and experts for a full week of lectures and discussions. The widespread interest for the summer school and the engaging discussions between the participants confirmed to us that there is a widespread appetite for diplomats and other public sector officials to delve more deeply into the cyber discussions and foreign policy aspects. And there are not too many opportunities to learn about all these issues. We could not imagine, of course, that our next training series would not just be about cyberspace, but also be moved entirely to cyberspace. And following the popular demand, we organized Cyber Diplomacy virtual masterclass last summer, which you can still see online. With the Winter School now, we wanted to offer you a training program that is more in-depth and also focused on several aspects of cyber diplomacy, what we are now discussing in all our global fora. Over the next 2 days, we will be joined by many distinguished experts from across the world, both current and former cyber diplomats, experts from leading think tanks, academia, and international institutions. The program is designed in such a way as to take you through all the key topics of cyber diplomacy. The first day should give you a good handle on the key issues of cyber diplomacy and offer an idea of the latest developments in global discussions in forums such as the United Nations and regional organizations. Today we will be discussing the development and implementation of the cyber stability framework, how it was discussed among the members of the United Nations group of governmental experts, how the consensus reports have created the normative framework, and how we are now at the crossroads at implementing the already agreed consensus. We intend to discuss the central role of the existing international law and its application in cyberspace, how the norms of responsible state behavior and confidence-building measures will contribute to more stability and predictability in cyberspace. We are also going to discuss the state of play of the discussions in the United Nations First Committee and the way forward. And today we will hear insights from the Asia-Pacific region on how cyber norms have been implemented there. Tomorrow, we will be offering both theoretical and practical insights as we discuss international law applying in cyberspace and look at ways how countries can increase cyber resilience through capacity building. Capacity building is key to cyber stability. It will help to implement norms, raise awareness on international law and confidence building. You will hear tomorrow from top experts of international law and from global leaders of cyber capacity building. The last panel tomorrow will also explain how to build up the resilient cyber system, how to protect critical infrastructure, and how to address cyber threats in reality. For every section, there is also the opportunity for you to ask the speakers all the questions you have had or you will have during those 2 days. You are following us via the workshop platform, and you can ask questions by clicking on Q&A under the specific agenda item and type your question there. If you are watching us via YouTube or Facebook, you can find the link to workshop in event description. Our team here will field the questions, and we will endeavor to answer as many questions as time allows. When we talk about cyberspace, the visual image we have is often dark server rooms and lone wolf hackers. That is just one aspect. For an actual visual cyberspace, just take a look around you. Cyberspace might be a fully man-made domain, but it touches everything, how the societies are run, how we learn, how we do business, how traffic lights change color, and how countries interact with each other. As cyber diplomats, that is what we are working to protect every day. Ultimately, our work seeks to protect not just the space around you, but also the human being in that space. As Jonathan said, human rights are an essential part of cyber diplomacy. When we talk about responsibility in cyberspace, we are always talking about technology being developed and used in a way that guarantees the protection of basic rights and freedoms. We are safeguarding our digital present and future and making sure that human rights remain at the very center. And now, let us progress to the first lecture of our winter school. We will have now the panel discussion between me and Dr. James Lewis on the overview of cyber stability framework, norms of responsible state behavior, international law, confidence and capacity building measures. Dr. Lewis is a renowned expert on cybersecurity and could be called one of the pioneers of cyber diplomacy. James works now as a Senior Vice President and Director of the Strategic Technologies Program from the Washington-based think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before joining CSIS, he worked at the US Departments of State and Commerce as a diplomat. He helped to develop policies on encryption, has been working on many internet-related policies, and was the rapporteur of the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts on developments of ICT in the context of international security during the successful 2010, 2013, and 2015 sessions of the UNGG. And of course, as an academic, he has authored numerous publications on cybersecurity. I'm very glad to welcome you, James.
Good morning, Heli. How are you?
Thank you. It's very cold outside here in Tallinn. It's minus 10 Celsius. I don't know how you call that in Fahrenheit. Can you calculate that?
Cold.
Cold, yes, okay.
Yeah.
So, how are you today?
Great. It's warm and sunny here in the South in the United States.
Okay, nice. So, we have real winter. So, if you had a winter school here, you should really be prepared for cold weather. Can I ask you,
I
James?
miss Tallinn.
You miss Tallinn. Well,
yeah.
We sincerely hope that maybe if not this summer, but maybe next summer, we will be able to welcome you here. Can we start our debate? Are you ready?
I'm all set. Thank you.
So, as an insider in all these United Nations First Committee discussions for a decade now, could you please tell us also what's the history of the cyber stability framework we are discussing today? We know that there have been cumulative groups of experts discussing the consensus reports, and in those consensus reports, several very important principles are set. For instance, the existing international law applies in cyberspace. We have, in 2015 report, all these norms described that we are now discussing again and trying to implement those norms. So it would be maybe useful for our younger colleagues and starting cyber diplomats to hear how the whole process has started and has evolved to a point where we are now.
Great, thank you, Heli. And I'll talk for about 12 minutes or so, and then we can go to the next question. We're now in our 23rd year of cyber negotiations. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. And there's two people, a Russian and an American diplomat, who've been involved from the start. So they're the deans of cyber diplomacy. This began in 1998 with a Russian proposal for a treaty governing cyber warfare. And the treaty was not endorsed by the UN. Some of the problems that a treaty had 23 years ago remain problems today. There's no agreed definition of what a weapon is. There's very flexible definitions on attack. And of course, you have immense difficulty with verification. So a treaty was unworkable. Then it's still unworkable, although eventually that may change and we may need some kind of treaty as information grows over time. In 2004, the Russians proposed a group of government experts, a normal UN mechanism to discuss difficult topics. This one was a little different, though. Very often these groups are truly academics or civil experts who get together to provide a substantive discussion. And in the GGE for cyber, it became sort of a proxy negotiation. So we've been having these negotiations among states for now more than 16 years, right? But what you've seen over time is a change in the composition of these groups. Originally, countries very often sent technical experts, people who ran networks, people who were the chief information officers or chief security officers. They've been displaced by professional diplomats with experience in international security, non-proliferation, people who know not the technology, although of course they're familiar with it, but whose principal expertise is negotiation. The first round of talks in 2008 was a very difficult round, and that was when I started working on this. I remember I showed up a day late, and when I got there, the people had projected on a screen on the wall the rolling text. There's a limit on the number of words you can have in a GG report. This was 4 times the number of words because it had huge amounts of bracketed text. So we came up with a technique known as the chairman's text, where the chairman would draft what he thought reflected the consensus of the group, and then it would be debated. In 2008, the debate was very intense, but it did set the precedent that we continue to use today. It identified norms, confidence building measures, and capacity building as the 3 pillars of stability in cyberspace. And it's interesting to note that originally it was norms and CBMs and drawing on the experience of arms control. It was the South African expert who insisted that we include capacity building as essential. These UN processes in this case are consensus based, meaning everyone has to agree. And he said basically, I will not agree unless we put capacity building in. So that's become a central part of the stability framework, and it was a very valuable contribution. 2013 saw kind of a breakthrough. I should note that all of these talks have very strong chairs. An Australian chair, a Russian chair, a Brazilian chair, and again a Brazilian chair now. So a German chair in 2017. The role of the chair is crucial for getting agreement in the GGE, and 2013 saw a breakthrough in discussion. And what it did was it clearly linked cyber norms, cyber rules to existing international practice, existing international law and rules. It made the UN Charter central to this discussion. It acknowledged the important role of state sovereignty in international law. And it recognized, albeit somewhat grudgingly on the part of some, the importance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And those elements continue to guide our practice. The UN Charter, state sovereignty, international law, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 2015 was the foundational agreement. It defined norms and CBMs, confidence building measures. There are 11 norms now in the 2015 agreement. It defines state responsibilities under existing international practice and commitments. And the benefit of 2015 is that the UN General Assembly endorsed it unanimously and said that states should be guided in their practice by the norms, confidence building measures, and capacity building measures identified in the 2015 report. So we do have an international agreement on cybersecurity. It's not perhaps as well known as it should be, but this is the basis for international agreement on these things. The value of norms is they provide agreed understandings among states on what their behavior should be, right? And so the norms have been a useful vehicle for advancing common understandings. Sometimes people say, well, why isn't it a treaty? Why aren't we doing more? And the answer is because you can't get agreement on a treaty, right? They say, why aren't the norms binding? Because you can't get agreement on binding norms. Norms are unusual practice in diplomacy, as many of you know. The original model that we used in 2010 in thinking about norms came out of the Missile Technology Control Regime, WMD precedent, where you had a group of states agree in a non-binding manner what responsible behavior would be, what their commitments are under the existing international framework. And that's been a useful and flexible model for cybersecurity. At some point, perhaps we will get to the point where there can be binding agreements, but we are not there yet. And Heli would know better than I that we're perhaps further away than we were in 2015. There's been some significant changes. The first is that the political environment has changed markedly. Whereas 2015, you could already see tensions that complicated getting agreement. It was a tribute to the skill of the Brazilian chair that we were able, he actually held the clock, if you remember, on the last day. These things are supposed to be end at 6. He held the clock. And so we went over to get agreement. It's now more difficult. I think we have skillful chairs. Another change is the addition of the open-ended working group. This is not a bad thing. In fact, in 2015, there was discussion about how we needed to move to this kind of format. The GGEs are limited in membership. They are closed meetings. They are not open. And there were complaints from other UN members that when I get this GGE report, I can't amend it, I can't change it, I can't discuss it. I'm just allowed to vote yes or no. I endorse it. And I think that's inappropriate. So the OEWG, which includes all UN member states, which is open, and sometimes, depending on the mood of some of the member states, sometimes includes non-state actors, is a more open format. It's probably the way we'll go in the future. But we have now, thanks to 2015, an agreed framework for what responsible state behavior is. There's broad interest in cybersecurity. That's what the OEWG has demonstrated. But there are also significant differences over a rules-based approach, over the role of universal values in cyber discussions. There's been proposals for new norms when the 2017 GGE failed to reach consensus. It was a very useful text. It was a text that probably would have reached agreement if it had not become hung up on the topic of international law, which we'll talk more about later on. But you've got this issue of, well, the UN failed in 2017, therefore a very vigorous discussion, public discussion occurred with people proposing new norms. There's dozens, or perhaps even hundreds of new norms. We don't really need any new norms. The 2015 norms are sufficient. The issue has become, how do we implement these norms? How do we get countries to observe them? How do we build them into state practices? So an important topic, but I urge you all, if you have not, to look at the 2015 report, which is the foundation for responsible state behavior. There's a debate over the role of non-state actors, right? And This is a debate that falls largely along political lines. Some countries argue that cybersecurity in the UN should be the sole reserve of states, that states bear the primary responsibility, and therefore other non-state actors should not be involved. That's the GGE, no non-state actors. However, Western states in particular, as well as some others, argue that the nature of international politics has changed. We must involve non-state actors, civil society, academics, businesses, and the OEWG attempts to do this. It allows for that kind of involvement by the non-state community. And I think this will be one of the primary tensions moving forward. We've seen it in other arms control arena, if you think about landmines or conventional weapons or even nuclear weapons. So cyber has now joined the portfolio of central international security topics. It is in some ways destined to become the most important as our societies become more dependent on virtual technologies, on the internet, on digital connections. So we have a good framework to build off from 2015, but there's a considerable amount of work. And we'll talk later on, I think, Kelly, about the role of international law, the role of regional organizations, which have proved to be very successful in implementing confidence building measures, and some of the challenges for the next round of discussion. I'll stop there.
Thank you, James, for laying the very good overview what we have achieved so far and what are the major challenges also with applying the normative framework in cyberspace. There are questions always asked from cyber diplomats in international conferences about international law and norms. So we have the voluntary, non-binding norms, peacetime norms. But at the same time, we also have the international law, which is not so voluntary. And when we are talking about international law applying in cyberspace, in other areas of diplomacy or international security, no one is questioning that international law should be applying. So it is just this small bubble of cyber people who is questioning that international law is applying. So it's for mainstream lawyers, this is sometimes a great question. Why this bubble of cyber people do not recognize some of them international law applying? So we recognize international law is applying. Estonia has done many efforts in order to raise awareness on the fact that all the principles of international law are applicable in cyberspace, and all our allies, I think, everywhere would also think so. And this question is still there. And when we look at the UN discussions, I think some additional explanation maybe is useful on international law. And hence my next question for you. Why the issue of international law is so complex? And how can we raise awareness on the fact that all these existing principles of international law that we have been applying in all the domains very successfully for a long time, for decades, how we can raise awareness that we are able to also apply those principles in cyberspace?
Well, Heli, I'm pleased to say, Ambassador Tirmakar, I'm pleased to say that there is agreement among all UN member states that international law applies to cyberspace. I'm sure that's a great relief. Unfortunately, there's no agreement on how it applies. And this is, of course, where the 2017 discussions broke down. It's still a difficult issue. Why is that? International law is the foundation of the voluntary norms agreed to in 2015. So it's the foundation of responsible state behavior. But it's also a complex issue because only state practice can define international law. It's not set by the opinions of academics or the views of the private sector. It's based on sovereign decisions to observe the commitments all countries have made to international law. And there's no real appeal to these sovereign decisions, right? This was the intent, of course, of setting up the Security Council many years ago, but that perhaps hasn't worked out quite as well as we might have hoped. There's always a tension between great power politics or realpolitik and the rules-based international order. And it's that tension that explains why you have this dispute when it comes to cybersecurity. I remember in one of the negotiations, I asked a diplomat from one of the major cyber powers who had just objected to, you know, an endorsement of parts of the UN Charter. I said, "Well, you've already agreed to it. Why do you care?" And he said, "Because cyber is a different domain, and cyber is a place where countries have yet to define how they will act. We have a good start in the 2015 framework, but there's always this tension that has increased in the past 2 years between the political intent of large nations and the desire for a rules-based order. So it's very difficult for us. These political differences explain the failure in 2017. I think that the two groups now, the GGE and the OEWG, learn from that and have developed a successful approach to allow countries to express their own views of international law. There's some key issues, though, that we need to talk about, and perhaps one of the most important is the role of offensive cyber action, what some people might call the militarization of cyberspace. And there's some nations who oppose this entirely, say that if we endorse international law, we're endorsing the laws of armed conflict, the things that grow out of the Geneva Convention. And this is, in fact, an endorsement of militarization and of cyber war. It increases instability. The counter to that is the UN Charter does not require nations to renounce force. And if you look at Articles 2.4 and Article 51, those are the key articles for defining the use of force in cyberspace. 51 is, of course, the inherent right of self-defense. 2.4 is the need for countries to obtain Security Council approval before engaging in the use of force. So one of the key problems for international law is this disagreement over the application for armed conflict. And I would call your attention to the 2015 agreement, which says that countries will not attack critical infrastructure, contrary to their international obligations. So it's not a ban on cyber warfare. It's saying that you must conduct it consistent with the principles established by the laws of armed conflict. And in particular, 2015 calls out necessity, proportionality, and distinction. Rules designed to protect civilian populations as far as possible in the event of armed conflict. So this is one of the foundational disagreements. Another foundational disagreement is the line between sovereignty and universal values, right? And so after 1945, countries felt that the old model of diplomacy, the old model of international relations, that gave emphasis to sovereign rights and gave countries a great deal of independence in their action, was one of the contributing factors to World War II. And so you saw the development of the UN, of international institutions, considerable additions to international law. The idea is that states would cede some of their sovereign authorities in order to increase stability, increase peace, and to protect their citizens, both in terms of their rights and from foreign attack. That decision in 1945 has come under question, right? And so some states are arguing that we've gone too far and we need to reassert the importance of sovereignty. So this debate between sovereign rights and universal commitments is one of the biggest shaping factors when it comes to international law. State practice shows that there's areas of ambiguity when you go to apply international law. What is the use of force in cyberspace? There's considerable disagreement over that. Now, a much more experienced UN diplomat told me once Stop worrying about this. If you look at the UN Charter, it doesn't define use of force. It doesn't define armed attack. These are decisions left to states to make, and to states to make in the context of the Security Council, right? And so in some of what we're seeing is we just don't have enough practice. I know that seems hard to believe. We just don't have enough practice to guide state thinking. Discussion is useful, academic research is useful, but state practice is still somewhat unformed. We're moving rapidly to change that, I regret to say, but these issues of what is the use of force, what is an armed attack, treatment of cybercrime and espionage, all of the UN negotiations generally start by taking these off the table, right? First, the negotiations occur under the aegis of the first committee, which is very much focused on arms control, on international peace and disarmament. So crime, espionage are not first committee topics. Espionage is not really addressed by international law at all, with very few exceptions. So we have topics that are considered not appropriate for our discussion, and that complicates the efforts to apply international law. We have a disagreement over what norms entail. How do you observe norms? States choose to observe norms. They're not binding. In contrast, as you said, states are obliged to observe international law. And so we have this uncomfortable balance between the obligation of states to follow international law and the decision of states to observe the norms agreed to in 2015, to observe the norms of responsible state behavior. Over time, I think the discussion will move in the direction of moving those voluntary norms increasingly to become binding commitments. But as you know from your long experience in these negotiations, this is a difficult process. It's one that will take time to achieve. I know we'll talk later about how to raise awareness of these norms, how to perhaps get countries more aware of them. I'm still amazed at how many people don't know that there's a universal agreement on responsible state behavior. And so in some ways, perhaps the UN could do a better job of publicizing this. I think that would be fair. In some ways, nations and regional organizations could do a better job of making their publics aware that we have a framework for responsible state behavior. In some ways, we need to think about actually using the norms, actually seeing countries observe the norms and follow the mandates drawn from international law. That would be useful in increasing awareness. So international law remains what I think of as the third rail, which is an Americanism for a dangerous topic. International law is the third rail of cybersecurity discussions, but that's because of these larger disputes over conflict, sovereignty, and human rights. If there was consensus among nations on those three topics, it would be much easier to make progress. But because there's disagreement that unfortunately appears to be increasing, it complicates the discussion of international law as it applies to cybersecurity. Let's close, though, on one note. There should be no doubt that international law applies to cyberspace. All nations have endorsed this. It is the basis of the norms and of responsible state behavior. And so one question for us is, if we, as the community of nations, see countries failing to observe their commitments, either under law or under the 2015 framework, what are the actions we take in response? But there is now global agreement that international law applies. We will need to work out how it applies, and that's proving to be difficult.
Thank you, James. And tomorrow we will have a lengthy panel on international law with renowned experts, and hopefully we can also explain to larger audience who is following our training during these days how international law applies. Can we now move back to the norms? We have been discussing now history of our normative framework and international law. And one of the discussions that we have in the United Nations and regional organizations and elsewhere is the implementation of our efforts so far. So the many GG norms presume that countries build resilience of their own critical cyber assets, of the critical infrastructure, and hence the capacity building was a specific item in the GG reports recently. So we have been discussing this in many fora, in many regional other organizations. What do you think, what are the priorities of implementation of our cyber stability framework? And what should we do more in order to raise awareness and implement cyber norms, law and confidence building measures, and how this could be taken to a different level where there is global awareness that we have the cyber stability framework agreed with all the elements in place, and the only thing what countries need to do is to implement it.
Thank you, Ambassador. So capacity building has been a crucial topic now for more than a decade. And as I mentioned, it was the South African representative to the 2010 OEWG who said, "I'm speaking for the developing world. This has to be a crucial part." And in retrospect, he was exactly right, because if you don't have the capacity to implement agreed norms, if you don't have a national policy, if you don't have the political and governmental organization for cybersecurity, if you don't have a framework of point of contacts, it's really very difficult for you to live up to your responsibilities. So capacity building has been a key part of this discussion. One of the things that's changed, though, is that in the start of the discussion, capacity building meant technical capacity. You know, you gave people servers and you gave them training in coding and you gave them network operation training. And what we rapidly found is this was not adequate, right? That the real basis of capacity building is its political policy making and the legal requirements that are equally important. So you need training in how do you make cyber policy? How do you develop cyber law? How do you write national policies and national laws that reflect your international commitments and at the same time serve your national interests? And this turns out to be really difficult. It's a moving target as we grow more and more dependent on cybersecurity. So capacity building has been crucial. There's things like the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise that can be very helpful. The regional organizations, the OAS, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the African Union have made significant strides in capacity building. But it's important to recognize that as the digital environment increasingly expands to cover all human activity, this is not a technical issue. And that's been one of the problems with making people aware of the framework of responsible state behavior. Less of a problem than it was a few years ago, but this is not a technical issue. This is a policy issue. This is an issue for international security. And it's an issue for international law. So where are we now? We have two processes, the GGE, Group of Government Experts, and the OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group. When this was created, these were competing proposals, one by one country, another by another country. And the UN did a very traditional UN solution when you have competing proposals. They agreed to them both. And at the time, some of us thought, this is going to be a problem because you have competing processes. And the answer is it's worked out quite well. The two chairs, who are both very skilled diplomats, work closely together. There's a little bit of issue on timing. I mean, what will be in one report, what will be in the other. but I think there's significant differences that make the value of having these two groups demonstrable. Some people say, well, why do we need two groups? I think they're very different in some ways. The OEWG is open. All member states appear. And some of the first meetings, you had more than 100 countries showing up. It was astounding. And what we discovered was there was a deep hunger for a global forum for states to discuss cybersecurity. We also discovered that states, while they needed to build capacity, there was a deep pool of talent. And when you look at some of the African countries, when you look at some of the South American countries, when you look at some of the Southeast Asian countries, amazing reserves of talent and expertise that mean that they should not have been, they always should have been part of the global discussion. So why do you need a GGE? The GGEs are smaller. They're a limited number of members. They're closed. And that means you can have franker, more direct discussions that on difficult topics that could lead to agreement. And having observed both an OEWG and a GGE, you know, someone says something, the chair goes down the list in the OEWG, and it might be 20 minutes before someone gets a chance to respond to an initial statement. In the GGE, it's more like a conversation, it's a discussion. So both mechanisms have merit. And there's a coordination problem, fortunately resolved because of the strong chairs this time. It's something to bear in mind. We still have significant difference over the rights of sovereign states and the importance of universal values. And I can't emphasize this enough because I think it's a growing area of dispute. The commitments that nations have made in the UN Charter, in the 2015 norms under international law, are not always observed. And so one of the questions for us is, how do we change that, right? Confidence building measures, there's been good progress, but in some areas they are not as effective as we might hope. A senior American diplomat once told me that the value of a hotline is questionable if when you pick up the hotline and call someone, the answer is always no, it wasn't us. So we might need to rethink how we do CBMs, how we do confidence building measures. The core of this issue is that cyber attacks do not pose an existential threat, right? And so that was something we had to grow out of in some ways. We came out of an arms control model that grew out of the issue of nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons do pose an existential threat. WMD is horrific. These things impelled nations to reach agreement, right? And we lack that incentive so far in cybersecurity. So it makes it a little more difficult to reach agreement. But this is clearly, as you heard the foreign minister say, part of the international agenda. It's clearly something that will increase in importance. So what is it we need to think about? The most important thing is, how do we bring nations to observe their commitments under international law and under the 2015 norms and framework for responsible state behavior? And this has led to a difficult discussion. Some of it's capacity building. Countries need to build their capacity to implement, to observe, to carry out, to cooperate. There's been real progress in the last decade, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. We need to develop common understandings of how international law applies, how the existing norms apply. Again, good progress, but still a lot of area for work. And so when you go into these discussions, you know, not everyone sees things the same way. What a surprise, huh? And developing those common understandings, as we have in other areas of international relations, is a task. Events like this are very helpful in doing that. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion over the next few days. Finally, in the difficult issue, the one that people are a bit nervous sometimes about discussing, is consequences for the failure to observe the framework for responsible state behavior. consequences for malicious action in cyberspace. A very difficult discussion. There have been times when issues like retortion, which is a concept under international law, I'm sure you'll hear more about, have come up. And they were not included in some of the texts because of the inability to reach agreement on them. There's considerable displeasure sometimes over the actions of individual states or groups of states to impose sanctions or to indict. This led to a whole long discussion that you'll find in all the documents on how do we attribute wrongful acts, right? And so you have one group of nations that says attribution remains difficult. We don't want to wrongly accuse a country of malicious action and then impose the consequences. And so this means we should delay in thinking about what the consequences for malicious action are. In point of fact, attribution is increasingly easy. There are private companies that can provide useful attribution services. Some states have powerful attribution capabilities. There's not agreement, though, on how you would share information on attribution. There's not agreement on common standards for attribution. And there's not yet agreement, although there's been progress, there's not yet agreement on what a menu of consequences would be for responding to malicious cyber action. And I think my own view is this is possibly the most important thing for giving meaning to norms. Norms are defined by consequences. If states choose to observe them, there's no need for consequences. But unfortunately, in the world we live in, we know that's not the case. So we need to think, how do we impose consequences for state action? And there's difficult issues. Perhaps our thinking on espionage needs to evolve in light of the growth of the internet. The whole issue of political coercion and political manipulation falls outside the discussion of use of force. The question of extraterritorial application of laws. These are all difficult issues. But I think a first step will be build the capacity, develop common understandings, and then, at least among like-minded nations, begin to impose consequences for malicious cyber actions that are contrary to state obligations under international law or the 2015 agreed framework on responsible state behavior. I think that's the most important topic for us now in some ways is what are the consequences if you fail to observe norms? And when we embed cybersecurity in the larger framework of international practice, that gives us a little guidance, right? How do we respond? But we can't expect, cyber used to be treated as something that was unique to itself. It's not. It's part of international relations now, and I believe everyone should recognize that. But then you say, well, what are the consequences for wrongful action now in state practice? It's very difficult to get global consensus on that. A different approach might be like-minded nations. You have questions then of attribution, of messaging to publics and to political leaders of why you think an action is necessary. But that will be the next steps. Build the capacity, develop common understandings, and impose consequences. On that note, let me conclude by calling out the really impressive performance of regional organizations. In 2013 and 2015, after the UN agreements, regional organizations picked up the task, both of making sure their members had common understandings, had the ability to build capacity, and had confidence building mechanisms that would let them respond to cyber incidents. And this came up in one regional organization. A member said to me, and I think to others, in this region, we're never going to have a war. We're never going to have the kind of malicious activity that you talk about. So why do I need confidence building measures? Well, part of it is you need it to have common understandings when you go to global fora like the UN. Part of it is, unfortunately, there are no defenses that are adequate to say that a country on another continent can't reach out and touch you. And at that point, you want the ability to cooperate with your neighbors. And there might be other incidents where knowing who to call, knowing that you have common understandings, that you have common policies is exceptionally valuable. So the Organization for American States, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the African Union, I want to call them out for making significant progress in developing confidence building measures, common understandings, and building capacity in the regions. Which one did I leave out? I left out the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. That one is a group of states that perhaps don't need as much in terms of capacity building. That's not entirely true, but it's more true than some of the other regions. The OSCE is an organization where there's a long experience with confidence building measures. So the OSCE is different from OAS, ARF, African Union, both in its history and in its extensive practice. But it is in some ways foundational. One of the topics that's come up is, should we find ways for these regional organizations to work with each other that isn't occurring on an informal basis? There's things that the UN should do. There's things that the regional organizations can do. But these mechanisms, these multilateral mechanisms, whether in the UN or in the regional organizations, are the way that we can move forward in ensuring the observation of a responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Consequences will be the topic of the future. How do we impose penalties on countries that fail to observe cyber norms? What form should those penalties take? Are they legal? Do they involve coercive action? Are they in the public eye? By the way, name and shame doesn't work. So just take that out of your vocabulary. But we need to define consequences. We need to work on common understandings. Discussions like this are very helpful. And I think building capacity will let all nations participate. You're not going to have a choice. You're all connected to the internet. Your infrastructure depends on the internet. You want to make sure your infrastructure is secure. That's where learning from the best practices of others can be useful. Your commerce will depend on the internet. That's where having common rules. And one of the changes between the start of this and now is that there used to be a firm line between internet governance and trade issues and internet security and cybersecurity issues. That line is increasingly blurring. So this will become, in some ways, one of the central diplomatic tasks of the next few years. How do we take the agreed framework, raise awareness about it, and move forward in our common understandings on how to implement it? So an exciting challenge, but also a very difficult one, and one that if you are a diplomat in this field, you will be working on for years to come. Heli, I'll stop there.
Well, I see all these years to come, so thank you, James, for giving
It's
us
good to
hope.
know that you've got full employment, huh?
Yeah, well, thank you. It was very good explanation. What are the challenges there in implementation of norms? And we have many questions that have arrived. So I am grouping those questions together. There is a first category of questions that actually is addressing what you just said, the implementation part of norms. So there is a question, what is the practical use of the non-binding voluntary norms if cyber powers are not adhering to them? And the similar question here is saying that, do you think is good faith enough not to attack major infrastructure? And do you think there will be consequences for the countries if they breach good faith? And also there is a question, what are the tangible effects of the norms that are agreed? And what are the next steps for formalizing the 2015 norms?
Great questions. Thank you. So norms provide a guideline for state behavior, right? They provide a basis for countries to decide among their political leaders how they should respond, how they should guide their policies, how they should act in cyberspace. So I think the norms are very valuable. We have common understandings based on 2015 about how countries should behave. These need to be expanded, they need to be fully observed, they need to be further developed, and the report of the OEWG, which is now available publicly, is a good step. It's a very strong report. So we're making progress, but norms provide the guidance for state behavior, and they can be very effective, right? So because you have many states observing the norms, this is valuable. Is good faith enough? This is a different discussion, and it's a more military discussion. When would it be useful for a country to attack critical infrastructure? Honestly, while we've seen hundreds of thousands of incidents of cybercrime, thousands of incidents of cyber espionage, there have really only been a handful of attacks on critical infrastructure. There's an implicit threshold that guides state action, and that implicit threshold is the use of force. States are very careful to avoid cyber actions that could create casualties or death or create destruction, physical destruction. That's the implicit threshold. There's no desire to agree to it in the UN. I know because I tried and failed. But this implicit threshold guides state action, and it's a strategic decision to cross it. You've seen this in a few places, but perhaps only 6 events. So I worry less about attacks on critical infrastructure than this might have been overemphasized in our earlier discussions. That's a debate point, of course. Where we have more difficulty is in what you could describe as actions, cyber actions intended to produce cognitive effect or reflexive action, cyber actions intended to create political instability. This is a difficult topic. We've only just begun the discussion of it. It will also take years to work out. So I think that infrastructure attacks are now something we can place in the existing framework of how militaries, how states choose to use force, right? And so if you think about that, it's a strategic decision about when you would attack an opponent's critical infrastructure. And fortunately, so far, that has only occurred in a very limited number of circumstances. Is there a tangible effect to norms? I think there is. The confidence building measures that we've seen, the exchange of doctrine, the identification of points of contact within countries, the development of common criteria, the sharing of best practices, all of those improve cybersecurity within nations. All of those are based on this normative framework. You know, we're looking at the larger issue, though, which is, well, have we achieved universal peace through cyber norms? We haven't achieved universal peace anywhere. So one of the things to do is don't think of cyber as a unique field. It's part of the larger fabric of international relations, and unfortunately, part of the larger fabric of international conflict. So people would like peace. I think that's great. Maybe someday we'll get there. But the tangible effect has been to at least shape nations' thinking, and in many cases, improve their performance when it comes to cybersecurity. Next question.
So the next question is the role of industry and civil society. Well, due to the time limitations, we do not have many companies joining us during these 2 days, but we will certainly do the follow-up events where also the different parts of our cyberspace will be represented. So the question for you is specifically, what is the role of industry and civil society in this very intergovernmental debate of state behavior?
Coincidentally, I think this week is the 25th anniversary of John Perry Barlow's poem, The Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, where he says, you might remember, "Oh, you weary giants of iron and steel," or whatever. We don't need you. This is a new domain, and governments need not play a role because we have our own independent political processes. Uh, he was wrong. States remain the central actors. When you look at the major cyber incidents, they are the acts of states, right? Only states possess the full array of destructive cyber capabilities and the resources and commitment to engage in the most damaging incidents of cyber espionage. So states retain a central position, but you had this debate, and this is where Barlow was right. The role of states, the role of sovereignty has changed in the last 30 years. States now share, in some cases, power with civil society, with corporations. They're still dominant, and I think that sometimes the debate tends to ignore that. I had a representative of a big technical company tell me once that his company had the same capabilities as NSA, the National Security Agency, and I said, that's amazing. I had no idea that you guys had nuclear submarines and satellites. They don't. But they do have a role. So we are working through experimentation on how to accommodate civil society and how to accommodate company interests. The discussion is made more complex by the fact that you have powerful states who reject the idea that these people have a role. So we have two debates at the same time. How do like-minded nations accommodate the legitimate value of having companies and civil society engaged in the debate? And at the same time, how do they deal with the rejection of that role by powerful and influential states? And the OEWG has been a good example of this. There's been real limitations on the ability of civil society to participate, and I think that was a mistake. You are seeing mechanisms observed, though. The Internet Governance Forum, the IGF, you have something now called IGF Plus, which is both the civil society actors and the state actors coming together. IGF Plus is an interesting development, and it could be a path forward. So it's something to watch. But I don't want to get into a long discussion of the Westphalian state. Its demise was predicted and has not yet come about. But clearly the role of the state has changed. The role of democracies in accommodating civil society and companies has changed. But that takes place in the context of a larger international conflict with states who reject civil society's role. So something that's worth pushing on, how can civil society meaningfully contribute? I'd look at the IGF Plus as a useful mechanism. The OEWG, should they ever agree to let a fuller discussion by non-state actors occur, could also be a useful mechanism. So we have these two parallel debates. How do we involve civil society and the private sector in the decision-making of democracies? How do we get them to play a role internationally when there are powerful countries who reject that role? So I think that's it's a topic to watch. Don't overestimate their value, but we also absolutely need them in the room. I am watching IGF Plus with interest.
So thank you. And I think also that the industry and civil society certainly have very important role. But as our training, of course, is for diplomats, so we have chosen to limit a bit here our focus for the discussions that we have in our diplomatic circles. And the last question for you, James, is the interrelation between the international law and norms. You already touched upon this, and I think we all know that sometimes for the non-cyber experts, it might be difficult to understand how these 11 norms and international law actually interrelate, because some of the wordings in the norms are also quoted from the existing international law. And related to this question, there is another question about the Tallinn Manual. I can respond very shortly on Tallinn Manual that this is a academic analysis that has been helpful in order to raise awareness on how international law applies. And it has been put together by leading academics, and therefore it has the textbook type of or academic analysis value for us. But of course, the states and governments themselves have to determine how they see international law applying. And it's the states' views and articulations of international law applying in cyberspace what we are here looking for. But coming back to the panel question, so the interrelation between the existing law and norms. Can you elaborate a bit?
Great. I'll just add briefly to your comment on the Tallinn manual. One area where the U.S., Russia, and China agree is that they all agree they don't like the Tallinn manual. So, it's nice to have. It's a useful guide, but it's, as Ambassador Termakar said, not definitive. One thing to bear in mind when you look at these documents, and you'll see it in the forthcoming reports of the OEWG and the GGE, they follow negotiating logic. They aren't drafted by lawyers, they're drafted by diplomats. That means you, right? So they follow a negotiating logic, and sometimes you'll hear academics or lawyers say, but this paragraph should be in section B, or this one should be. What the chair needs to do to get agreement is the fundamental principle for how these documents are designed. So think of it as negotiating logic, and it's interesting to work back. Why did they make this decision? For example, the norm that says not to attack critical infrastructure contrary to your international obligations, that began as an agreement, as a proposal not to attack critical infrastructure in peacetime. And people objected to that language. Peacetime is unclear. Perhaps that says more about the state of current international relations than we might wish. But the workaround then was this international commitments, which includes the laws of armed conflict. Norms implement international law. They are common understandings among states on how their existing responsibilities under international law apply in cyberspace. What form they will take in the future, whether it becomes law through state practice or whether there is a binding agreement, remains to be determined. But the norms implement international law, and that's why they reflect the language in there. One useful thing to think about is, how does international law apply in other domains for international security? It's not like there's a traffic cop who will give you a ticket when you violate international law. What we found is that cyber has moved from being a unique domain to a domain that's now integrated with and increasingly becoming central to all other domains, all other areas of conflict and international relations. So we shouldn't expect cyber norms to be any different than the norms that we have in areas regarding human rights, responsibility to protect, non-proliferation. There's a balance between norms and international law. And norms are in some ways the forerunner of international law. Norms shape state practice, and over time, that means it will become international law, right? The issue for us in this is a larger one, and it's one I think you're all familiar with, which is the idea of a rules-based international order has come under intense challenge. When you look at rules for trade, several countries have questioned the mechanism set up. When you look at rules for monetary policy, there's a whole set of developments, some technological, some political, that challenge cooperative action on monetary policy. And there's an immense challenge when it comes to international security and the idea of a rules-based order, in that we have significant incidents over the past few years of countries choosing not to observe international law in their use of force or coercion. And I'm not singling out any particular country. We can think of some that have done badly, but that might be not just confined to non-democratic states. So our goal is to think in this larger context as we develop the framework for responsible state behavior, as we take the agreement from 2015 that created that framework, how do we implement it? How do we use it to strengthen a rules-based international order? Ultimately, we learned the hard way in the 20th century that a rules-based order is the one that best preserves peace and stability. And I hope we don't have to have hard lessons on that again. I think we can avoid that. But the cyber discussions are part of this larger debate about how do we extend a rules-based international order to reflect the changed international environment and the new challenges brought by digital technologies. So norms play an essential role in this. Norms are the forerunner. Norms are the things that guide. I had a lawyer once who was involved in Tallinn manual tell me, you know, if you diplomats would just get out of the way, we lawyers could solve this problem in a week. And the answer is no, you couldn't, because you need the political commitment of national governments to make progress. And norms are an expression of that political commitment. Now we need to think about how we get countries to observe those commitments as part of a larger rules-based order. So I think we're on the right path, but it's going to be bumpy and it will take some time. So that's good for you because, as I said to Heli, this is a discussion that will continue for years. This is a good area to develop expertise.
Well, thank you, James. I think these are golden words that the discussions will continue for many years, and we really have to make sure that the norms will guide our behavior in the digital domain in those coming years. Thank you so much, James, and also thank you for hanging Estonian colors in your wall there. So I think
Thank you.
This is a nice picture in Estonian national colors. And so I wish you a very productive week in DC, and I hope that the weather stays mild, and we will see each other at one of our virtual events soon again. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, I am pleased to introduce the first panel discussion on the United Nations First Committee Cyber Developments. This is focusing on implementation of norms of responsible state behavior and the way forward with the UN First Committee, cyber processes. All our four speakers at the panel are very well versed in the United Nations issues. And as we are discussing now the implementation of the norms and how international law applies, the confidence building measures and capacity building in two parallel working groups in the UN, I think our speakers today will represent a very good view also on both global and regional basis, how they see the implementation of the norms going forward and what is the way forward for us in general in the UN First Committee. The panel chair, my good colleague Dr. Janne Tallas, is Cyber Ambassador of Finland. Hi, Janne. Before assuming the post of Cyber Ambassador, he was Finnish ambassador to Italy, Malta, and San Marino. And he has also spent 5 years as a deputy permanent representative of Finland to the United Nations. So he knows how the UN works. So the panelist, Henry Verdier, is ambassador for digital affairs at the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Hello, Henry. He has been dealing with digital issues in the public sector for many years, having previously served as France's Interministerial Director for Digital Transformation and Communication Systems. Also as a Chief Data Officer and Head of ETALab. Before joining the public sector, Henry was entrepreneur and co-founded the startup MFG Labs. I hope this pronunciation was right. Then we have Johanna. Johanna Weaver is a special advisor to Australia's cyber ambassador. Hi, Johanna. And Australia's chief negotiator at the United Nations working groups. She's a former commercial litigator and has served as an Australian diplomat before specializing in strategic cyber policy. And she also led the team working with Australia's inaugural cyber ambassador, where she oversaw the drafting and implementation of its first international cyber engagement strategy, among other things. And then we have a voice from very far away from Estonia, from Mexico. And my good colleague, Isaac Morales, is a coordinator for multidimensional security issues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Hi, Isaac. He's in charge of negotiations on cybersecurity and cybercrime, as well as transnational organized crime, arms trafficking, and arms control, financial crimes, corruption, and other emerging security challenges. He has represented Mexico in global and regional meetings, and in addition to the GGE, for example, at the Organization of American States, a working group on confidence-building measures in cyberspace. And also he's a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to different specialized committees on security affairs. With this very knowledgeable panel, I am very glad to give the floor over to you. And so the chair is Janne. So the floor is yours, Janne, please.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Haley. I'm very happy to be here. I thought I will start with laying some basic foundations from the first committee perspective, and then we will have Henri, followed by Joanna and Isaac last. Sorry. I think my point starts with the simple. I think in some other meetings that hi, I'm Janne, and I am a disarmament expert. That's what is used in some other meetings. My take is that we will look at after James's excellent presentation, that laid out the strategic field of cyber. Now we will drill into the disarmament issues and non-proliferation, the first committee. So we will need to look at the box of disarmament, non-proliferation, and how the cyber issues fit into that box. That is my kind of idea. I will kind of introduce that, and I think then we will follow with Henri and others. But I think that is clearly this is the slice of the cyber that falls into the disarmament field. I think it is paramount that we will start by understanding what we mean by the disarmament issues. And I think it is something that we have to wrap our mind, especially after James's strategic big view perspective, because the traditional disarmament and non-proliferation issues are very straightforward. They look things from the state perspective for the state security. This is what the UN First Committee has always done. That is the bread and butter. It aims at disarmament and arms control. So in practice, the negotiations have been on a relatively straightforward, limited set of issues. Restrict the number or readiness of weapons. There have been lots of treaties, INFs and so forth. So restrict the numbers of weapons, or kind of actual numbers, or readiness, the weapons in the readiness. There has been negotiations to ban certain type of weapons or technologies. There has been an important process and several processes to limit the access to weapons and technologies to only states. So there has been lots of negotiations how to restrict non-state actors to accessing certain weapons or technologies. And then there has been a tradition to discuss the confidence building measures. This is pretty much what the first committee, the non-proliferation disarmament, has been doing for 75 years. Obviously, that approach does not fit very well with the cyber. It's clearly, I think there are some fundamental flaws. I think the first clear flaw is that this assumes an extremely stable technological base. That this is not the case in cyber. So technology changes so fast, there are new innovations and things do change. So kind of it is extremely difficult for the diplomatic process to catch up. Yeah, we had the nuclear weapons in first time used in the mid 40s, and then we had 60s, early 60s, the first treaty that limited non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So it took about 20 years to resolve that issue. We don't have that time. That's very clear. We also have lacked the meaningful distinction between the civilian and the military. That doesn't work in the cyber world, and that has been the paramount for the for all the disarmament discussions and that has taken place in the last 70 years. Clearly, the emergence of extremely powerful kind of non-state civilian actors, producers, and actors, and I think that's a fundamental issue. Also, I think the final point, the third point that makes this extremely difficult to fit into the old school disarmament non-proliferation is a very dubious verifiability. It is extremely difficult to verify anything. So I think that's a bad news, that the cyber does not fall quite nicely into the disarmament field. But I think the good news is there has been attempts to kind of get rid of the straitjacket of the disarmament thinking. The three historic attempts that has been tried has been first through the Security Council. I think I'll take the Security Council Resolution 1540. So there was a possibility to restrict the access of certain type of technologies and weapons to non-state actors through the Security Council. That was clearly a new opening. We can argue about that, but I don't see that being available for this. I think James described the international environment quite well, but I think that was after 9/11, there was a strong push for that kind of direction. So that's, unless we have a major change of international kind of environment, I doubt that will be possible to achieve. The second solution that has been tried, these are all kind of empirical facts or attempts to resolve the issue that we are dealing with, is kind of Ottawa type of solution. Have the anti-personnel landmines, and followed by cluster munitions, and lately nuclear weapons. Take the issue out of the UN and create some sort of like-minded group, and then discuss the issue and prepare for some sort of principles or treaty. That has been used increasingly. It can produce something that is kind of instruments, but how strong they are not universal. I think maybe the way to conceptualize is that if the vegetarians just one day get together and decide to ban the meat eating, that would be kind of one way to approach it, but that might not be the right way to go for the universal cyber war. I think the third attempt that has been tried in the disarmament non-proliferation field has been on the small arms and light weapons, where we almost 20 years ago there was a program of action was launched that would actually bring in new actors. That significantly increased the number of actors. For example, the producers and the traders and the civil society was brought in for the first time properly in the negotiations. It also included clearly new topics, and that time you have the gender and development issues were brought in. And I think that was the idea, that you set up certain principles and then start to push for their strengthened implementation. Situation is relatively close to that of what we have right now in cyber world. We have, as James described, a set of principles that we all have signed to, a 2015 GGE set, and then I think the issue is now how to implement them better, how to look ways to push the states to follow these principles better. It is interesting. There was another major innovation in the project, that it clearly divided the traditional implementation process or review process in two aspects. The small arms and light weapons program of action clearly had two types of follow-up meetings. First, focusing on the implementation of the principles, and then on the review of the principles. And I think that is a quite interesting innovation. That's the first time it was done, and it might actually serve quite well the discussions in the cyber world. So I think my kind of brief introduction is really to set the kind of first committee scene for the issues that kind of how the cyber fits into this awkward box of first committee issues. And I think I will then give floor to Henri, who has fleshed out some of the issues in more detail. Henri, please.
Thank you, Jan. Distinguished colleagues, dear participants, I'm very happy to be here today. And first, I want to thank Estonia for the invitation. 2 years ago, I had the chance to came to Tallinn for the summer school. I didn't speak very well English. I don't speak much more, but a bit better. And to be frank, I miss the real world, the world where France and Finland are neighbors because of alphabetical order, the world where we can take a beer and deepen the conversation with Johanna and Isaac. But I hope that soon we will come back to this real world. It's great that you managed to still gather us and give the next generation of cyber diplomats the opportunity to meet and exchange. And yes, we have to speak about a very important issue. So I want too long put the emphasis on the fact that we have a serious issue. Other speakers probably told this today. We depend more and more on digital. We are more and more vulnerable. We have to face cyber criminality and state attacks, and sometimes it's difficult to make the departure. And it's a completely new strategic context, of course, because the old vision of deterrence, of dissuasion, is very difficult to implement here because it's difficult to know who is attacking you, and it's difficult to prove that you can inflict consequences. So we have to think differently. We have to learn from the history, and Jan did remember some steps of this history, and we have to invent something. As you said, and just one last point, here, international law, international order, state cooperation will be very important, and the job we are doing in the United Nations is very important. But France considers that it's not enough, and that if we want to increase the stability and security of the cyberspace, we also have to work with civil society, with companies, to promote capacities and to help every country to build capacities, to promote security by design, to promote the responsibility of private sectors, because the ground here is weak. We are building our civilization on a very archaic cyberspace. So law is major, very important, but we need also good infrastructures. And we try to promote both ideas. As you said, now, those years, we have in the United Nations 2 tracks processes with a government expert group and an open-ended working group. France participates to both actively and on good faith, and we discover that both have their merits, their strengths, and I believe that we managed to avoid the duplication or too much duplication between the 2 groups. We believe that it's of primary importance to continue to developing the governance of cyberspace, that this governance will be the fruit of our discussions, negotiations, and cooperation between states and with all the stakeholders. Therefore, we need to create the framework and the rules which will enable us to do so on the long term. And that framework should be within the United Nations, because the United Nations is universal by nature. Therefore, decision here can be taken by consensus decision and become international law. Now, regarding this current work in the United Nations, we think that there is a genuine desire for regular institutional dialogue that would give us a chance for all states to participate in an inclusive manner and would provide a clear political commitment. France, as I said, thinks that we also need a permanent solution that allows for more multi-stakeholder engagement. This is why, and I will speak a bit about this, we have put forward, along with 47 other states from all continents, a proposition for a new vehicle, which is a program of action, a POA. We did this because we think that we need to find a solution which is pragmatic, inclusive, and that gives us long-term options. Estonia and Finland are sponsors as well, and I know that Mexico and Australia are very supportive of it. Maybe they will confirm or deny, we'll see, but I have some signals. Today I will try to answer to three questions. Why does it seem like the right way to go? Why would it look like? And how do we envisage going forward? And then I will share with you a bit more about two specific benefits that we can expect from this POA. So why does it seem like the right way to go? We believe that it will be one element contributing to peace and stability in the cyberspace. As part of various processes on cyber issues, more or less institutionalized, France has been able to compare merits and draw some conclusion. As I said, France has been a member of the GGE since the first ones. We have seen this format evolve and produce concrete and serious results. At first, the GGE was more a forum where it was possible for experts from different countries to discuss and to exchange ideas, even when they did not share the same point of view, and that was a great opportunity. And now we have agreed on a set of recommendations, norms, and principles. It is a basis of what states considers to be the international framework for responsible states' behaviors in cyberspace. And that's very important, and we have to protect this legacy. This year, we had the chance to get back to the table and start negotiating again with the beginning of a sixth GGE. It was also we are making great progresses, and it was also the beginning of another group, the Open-Ended Working Group, chaired by Ambassador Lauber, and I discovered the advantage associated with it. An open-ended working group is inclusive, open to other stakeholders. I believe that almost 120 countries have participated in at least one session so far. The conclusion that we draw from participating to both formats led us to believe that it's time to propose something new, something that would be a kind of synthesis of all the other processes, and that would actually unify them and would not risk being politicized. And of course, everyone in both rooms would prefer a one-track work, because the two tracks is exhausting and can be dangerous, because the two tracks can start to oppose themselves. But also, and that's why we did propose a new format, the discussion in both groups convinced us that we need something focused on implementation, something action-oriented, because, as I said, capacity building, exchange of return of experiences, work on technical standards matters, security by design. We need to build a stronger cyberspace. This is why we started to work on the idea of the POA, and we have now presented a food for thought papers publicly, along with, as I said, 47 other states, which are Egypt, Argentina, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Gabon, Georgia, Iceland, Japan, Lebanon, Montenegro, Morocco, Norway, Salvador, Singapore, the Republic of Korea, the Republic of Moldova, the Republic of North Macedonia, the United Kingdom, and I won't enumerate the European Union and its member states, all the member states. Why do we believe it would provide such an opportunity, and what would it look like? A POA can take various forms, but it's based on a political declaration and a set of commitments. Some POA are made of a single document, others are presented as a declaration and another document, but the goal remains the same. The idea of having a POA was first mentioned by my Egyptian colleague during the open-ended working group. He was particularly thinking of the POA on small arms and light weapons. We looked more into it, and we thought that the format was relevant. The POA could create a politically binding framework based on agreed norms, principles and recommendation, and especially those coming from the past GGEs. The POA could also enable us to adopt new recommendations in areas that would be identified as priorities. The POA will have review conferences, so we'll be able to review it on a regular basis and add some new elements if we have consensus. It is action-oriented. We will not just discuss about concepts, but very concretely, states will be able to provide reports on the implementation of agreed norms and principles, and it can host other initiatives, like, for example, about capacity building. If we design this correctly, a POA can allow the participation of other stakeholders in the spirit of the Paris Call, and I believe that it should allow us to cover all the issues that we work on today, norms, the evolution of technologies, cooperation, and at the same time offer a long-lasting solution, yet flexible. Yes, I say this now, I wanted to say this later, but no. From our perspective, one specific difficulty with the GGE and Open Data Working Group is that in a precise time, we are negotiating a final report, and everyone is preparing the last week, and we have this end of negotiation effect. A continuous program with intermediary reports can be more flexible, and we can more iterative, and we can share results as far as we have results. What is the way forward? So during the informal virtual consultation of the Open-Ended Working Group at the end of last year, we have had discussions on what could be a regular institutional dialogue in the United Nations, and our proposition was that the POA should be the chosen format. We have received the draft report, and we are pleased to see that it is one of the proposed recommendations, so we'll discuss this very soon. Next week, we'll have informal consultation, and in March, we should have the final session in New York, if the context allows it. We hope that the report will be adopted and that it will be one of the recommendations. In the GGE as well, we hope that it will be one of the recommendations. As you may know, Russia has presented a resolution this year to create a new open-ended working group next year. To be frank, some people are concerned because they ask if we can manage both tracks or if we have to merge both tracks, etc. To be honest also, France, we were surprised to see Russia presenting a new draft resolution now, when the first open-ended working group is not even over yet. And to be very frank, we consider this as a bit disrespectful for the work we are doing within the first open-ended working group. So far, we want to conclude the first open-ended working group, and we hope and we plead to have this final recommendation of a new possibility of establishing a regular institutional dialogue when its mandates reach full terms. We think that it would have been more efficient not to anticipate the discussion. We did not wish to introduce a resolution this year because we wanted the current groups to continue and conclude their work. Maybe we'll have to, but we still hope that it's possible to launch the POA as a conclusion of the two groups. And nevertheless, whatever will happen, we do not think that this initiative will impede our project. So we'll find a way to coexist. That's my second point. So two words about what we can expect from POA. The first very important aspect is the participation of all stakeholders. As James said, and a lot of us, I think, states didn't build the internet, states don't manage the internet. If we want to protect the internet, if we want to increase security and stability, we have to deal with every stakeholders. This is why we did launch the Paris Call 2 years ago, which is now the largest multi-stakeholder initiative of cybersecurity in the world, with more than 1,000 supporters. Now we want to ensure that the POA will enable discussion with all stakeholders. For now, we see two ways it could be done, and they are compatible. And I believe that we can do both. So the first one would be to imagine an observer statute for some organization that would apply and that would give them the possibility to assist and to participate in some of the discussion, even if they don't vote. The second one could be to have dedicated session, a bit like we did in December within the open-ended working group, means to address specific issues with other stakeholders. We think that there cannot be a forum of discussion on ICT today that does not include discussion with stakeholders. And to make sure that we'll find the right format, France has also been active within the Paris Call to connect the dots between what we do in the United Nations and the large communities that we have gathered. And this year we have launched a consultation within the Paris Call regarding our work in the United Nations, and the results have been shared with the community. We use the result of this consultation during our work in this open working group. The French position is inspired by this ongoing conversation with all stakeholders. And that's very interesting to exchange with companies and researchers. We realized that many participants were genuinely interested by what is being done in the United Nations, and that very few really knew what we were working on. But we hear also a claim for more security and more stability, and the companies, the researchers, the civil society, the civil rights organization don't believe that international law is enough. They want us to launch concrete action, to build better infrastructures, to cooperate faster. And that's also why we promote this position, because there is a strong demand from the civil society. I try to be brief. Now we did launch 6 working groups within the Paris Call to continue this conversation. One of this group is about supporting the continuation of the United Nations negotiation with a strong multi-stakeholder approach. This group will think about the best way to support the continuation of the discussion and the inclusion of multi-stakeholder voices. And of course, we will share and use these results. First, we will share the results publicly, and then we will try to use this when we build the next step. The second and last very important thing is that we can expect a better implication in capacity building. As I said, we need every country to be able to protect itself. And one of the goals of the POA is to create a framework to make sure that countries can better identify what they need, and for providers to create programs adapted to those needs. We may use, for example, but probably Isaac or Joanna will speak about it, we may use, for example, a survey that was proposed by Australia and Mexico in the open-ended working group. It was an initiative that they presented and that we did co-sponsor. It is meant to help states assess whether or not they fully apply the norms and principles that they have agreed upon. So to conclude, I think that we need clearly underscore that the past DGs have been successful. I do not know yet about the open-ended working group, but I really do hope that it will be also. But we now need to have an action-oriented forum. We need to foster cooperation and information sharing. We need to allow for broad participation. Also, in an ever-evolving environment, we need predictability, and we need to be able to change when the technology changes. As the POA will be a permanent format, it will give us a stable framework, but a framework that can evolve. That is why a POA could be, in our mind, a concrete step towards success. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Henri. Thank you for your important work with Paris Call and also with the POA. Clearly, I think the idea to consolidate the work with the POA and bring in the stakeholders better and launch the capacity building, there seems to be really the key ideas. Next is Joanna, who has established herself as the most eloquent of open-ended working group delegates. So with her metaphors are causing always ripples. So Joanna, please.
Thank you, Jana. I don't know if I can, well, I hope that I can live up to that very warm introduction. Colleagues, I wanted to start, like Henri, by thanking Estonia for this course. But I also really wanted to welcome all of you to the domain of cyber diplomacy. If you're doing this course, I hope that means that you are in the process of or about to embark upon what I think is the most interesting area that you can be working on in foreign policy. You get the opportunity to work on issues that matter, and unlike so many areas that you work on within a foreign ministry, you actually get the opportunity to shape the future. We talk about the concept of cyber diplomacy. It is increasingly becoming mainstreamed through our foreign ministries. It is undeniable now that cyber and tech issues are absolutely fundamental to our national and our international security, to our economic prosperity, and to our development. So I am of the firm view that cyber diplomacy will very soon become just diplomacy, and that every diplomat will need to be able to speak about these issues in the same way that we expect all of our diplomats to be able to speak about topics like human rights or basic economic policy. So welcome, and I think you'll find that this is an area that you will enjoy and have a very fruitful career in. I wanted to start by talking about two myths that I most commonly come across to people who are new in this area when we start talking about implementation of the norms of responsible state behaviour. The two most common things that I get asked, and this is evident by the questions that were put to Jim, is how are the norms useful if they're voluntary? And the other question, which I haven't heard come out so far, but which I know is often on people's minds, is if we want stability in cyberspace, why don't we argue and why don't we commence negotiations for a treaty? So I'm going to take those two as a starting point, and then I'll talk a little about regional implementation and Australia's expectations for the two processes that we have that are ongoing. So to take to the first questions, why and how are norms useful if it is that if they are voluntary? I think the first important part of this is to remember that norms are one part of the framework of responsible state behaviour that Jim described to you just before. So norms sit alongside, complement international law, but they don't replace international law. So international law is binding, it's binding on all states. Norms complement international law. They are voluntary, but they help us to understand and to set expectations of state behaviour. The other two elements of this framework are confidence building measures and capacity building. But the most common misperception when people talk about norms in this area is to forget that norms sit with international law, which is binding. So one example of this is if we think about the norm on critical infrastructure protection, that we, for example, shouldn't intentionally damage or impair the use or operation of critical infrastructure using ICTs. Now, if your critical infrastructure as a state is damaged in a way, you may choose, for example, to respond to that malicious activity by calling out or by referring to the norm of responsible state behaviour, that there has been a violation of that norm. But likewise, depending on the circumstances, depending on the severity, you might also call it out as a violation of your sovereignty. a violation of the international legal principle of non-intervention. If it reaches particularly severe thresholds, it might also reach the threshold of an armed attack and trigger your Article 51 right to self-defense under the UN Charter. So this is an example of how we need to, if we're talking about norms, also remember we need to talk about the other pieces of the puzzle as well. When we have, and I think Jim made this point really well, when we talk about norms, norms combined with international law set clear expectations of responsible state behaviour. If we don't set expectations, if we're not clear about what we think is right and wrong, then it's very difficult to measure whether those expectations are met or not. So just because the rules are broken doesn't mean that the rules don't have value, because being able to say that the norms, the rules have been broken is important, and being able to respond is also important. And I think Jim flagged the consequences aspect will become increasingly important. But norms also aren't just about setting or responding to bad behaviour. They are also about signalling expectations, and they provide a capacity building function. So for example, the partner norm to don't damage critical infrastructure is a norm that says states should protect their critical infrastructure. So these norms help communities, help countries that are maybe new to these discussions recognize and prioritize things that they should be doing in this space. And that serves a really important purpose in and of itself. The GGE is currently working on some really useful, I think, guidance in terms of norm implementation. The survey of national implementation, which Australia, Mexico, and a number of other countries have put forward in the open-ended working group. The idea of that is that we measure our implementation and that countries actually actively survey and report back on that. That's a useful way that we can look at implementation. Also, the POA that Henry was referring to, and I can certainly confirm that Australia is a strong supporter and advocate of the POA proposal. So I would stress there, norms serve a very important purpose, notwithstanding the fact that they are voluntary. So I'll move now onto the question of why, if we want stability, do we not argue for a convention in cyberspace? Well, as Jim mentioned, we have previously agreed that international law applies in cyberspace. This was first agreed in 2013, was reaffirmed in 2015 in the GGE, but endorsed by every country in the world in the UN General Assembly resolution, which passed by consensus. So my primary concern with the argument, or the countries that are arguing for a convention, is that they may want to pick and choose particular pieces of international law that might apply in cyberspace, as opposed to the understanding that we have now that international law in its entirety applies in cyberspace. I would say, though, that regardless of whether you are from a country that supports a convention or has some skepticism about the motivations for a convention, I think there is universal agreement that we do need to have more of a conversation about how it applies. This is an important point, and I think Jim's point about the universe, cyber is not that different. I think we have to be very careful that we don't set ourselves higher expectations in cyberspace than we do in other areas. So, for example, if you asked a bunch of countries to articulate views on sovereignty in the physical context, you probably there will be differing views among experts. That doesn't mean that there isn't international consensus. What's important is that we each understand each other's perspective, each other's views, and that in doing so, that creates predictability and stability. We can understand and calculate and respond in our behaviours knowing what the other thinks. And this is really important. The other thing, the other aspect of a question around do we need a convention on cyberspace is if we have agreed, and we have very clearly agreed, that existing international law applies in cyberspace, my question is, point to me where the gaps are. Point to me where existing international law does not provide a guideline or an obligation for behaviour. Now, it may not always be respected, but if you can point to the gaps in that, that is a point where I think we can start to have a genuine consideration about a convention. The fact is, many countries haven't yet got to a point where they have formulated their national positions. And if countries haven't independently formulated their national positions, it's very difficult to identify where these gaps exist. So regardless of whether we want to move in the direction of a convention or if we're looking at implementation through, for example, a POA-style body, the next step really is that countries develop their national positions and views on this. And then, if gaps are identified, then we can discuss next steps. But we need to ensure that those next steps are inclusive, that they're not just a conversation among a few countries. And I think, again, the POA provides a very useful forum to be able to have those in-depth and continued discussions. I wanted to speak very briefly about regional implementation. When we're talking about implementation of norms of responsible state behaviour, I think the ASEAN region really has some great examples in this. The ASEAN Ministers Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity back in 2018 endorsed the norms in principle, and they've now established a roadmap for the implementation of those norms. This really is quite a world-leading approach, and I think it's important to acknowledge Singapore's leadership in particular in that. From Australia's perspective, we have, as part of the open-ended working group process, gone through and identified Australian implementation of the norms of responsible state behaviour and published this. When we were doing that exercise, we were frankly quite surprised by how many examples of norm implementation we had. And I think most countries, if you conducted the survey, for example, the Survey of National Implementation, would be pleasantly surprised that you are implementing many of these norms, at least in some form. Whether we can better, improve that implementation, of course, and having those discussions, for example, in the POA forum may provide a really useful way to do that. But it does represent the fact that the norms themselves were articulated by experts, and the experts didn't pluck the norms from nowhere. The norms had a discussion, the experts had a conversation and said, what is best practice in these areas and how can we articulate that? So it really isn't a top-down UN imposing this upon states. It has been an examination of what is best practice. And therefore the implementation piece here is really important. In terms of the way forward, very briefly, I think Jim, again, has really nailed it. We need to take this framework, we need to deepen awareness, and we need to implement these agreements. And I think whatever discussion comes next, whether it is a POA or an open-ended working group or something entirely new altogether, it must be inclusive. And it must be something that all countries have the opportunity to shape. I think it must provide a forum for ongoing discussion on important issues like international law to deepen our common understandings of how it applies, but also norms. Do we need more, for example? But we can't just keep having discussions. We also need implementation. And it's all well and good for Australia to look at our implementation, but we need to support other countries to do implementation as well. And in a way that allows for force multiplication of effort. every country is struggling with these issues, let's use our collective hive brain power to share and develop those best practices, both in the delivery but also in the requests for capacity building. Capacity building coordination, I think, should be a key focus of whatever comes next. And we definitely also need to have an inclusive conversation with multi-stakeholder actors as well. Now, incidentally, all of those things would be delivered through the program of action. If the program of action goes forward, and Australia is certainly hoping that it will, it is something, however, that all countries will have the opportunity to shape, to say, and to agree in the discussions of its mandate. So I think the next period of time is going to be really exciting as we look to conclude the open-ended working group negotiations in a little over a month, and then the GGE in May. So watch this space for more exciting updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. You did not disappoint. Thank you for inspiring presentation, and also really addressing the aspiring cyber diplomats. This is a great field, and it's kind of it's interesting field. Hey, all talking to this aspiring cyber diplomats, please put out your questions. You have a opportunity to ask really good experienced people on anything about the cyber diplomacy and how we go forward with the process, complicated processes. So put forward questions while Isaac is giving his presentation. So we'll be willing to answer all the questions. But with the Isaac and with the important role Mexico and Isaac has played, Isaac, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. It's going to be difficult to talk on something interested you after my very excellent presentation of my very good colleagues. But at the same time, many things have said, so it's easier to me to build upon what already have said. So just let me first to say that I am very glad joining this panel. I have to recognize the efforts of Estonia, the efforts of Heli herself, organizing this cyber school, and despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to keep open this track to engage diplomats in these very substantive and timely discussions. From my own perspective, I have to say that this conversation for me is more important than ever. Because exactly our more dependence, if I may say, to the technologies, because of the challenges, the logistical challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, also I have to say that the opportunity to share the view of a country such as Mexico, coming from Latin America, it's from my point of view, by itself, an effective cyber diplomacy measures. I mean, it's changing views, ideas, approaches among countries and regions. It's really an effective cyber diplomacy measure. So our discussion is concentrated, of course, on first committee processes. But it is important to that if you want to follow and to have the whole picture on cyber, on what diplomatic discussions are happening on cyber, you of course need to follow also third committee discussions on cybercrime, second committee discussions on technologies and development, also to focus our attention on the Geneva discussions on international law on human rights and international humanitarian law. And of course, we have also to attend to those developments and cross-cutting process happening on digital technologies through the whole UN framework. Then, even when following concrete mandates and respecting separated responsibility of organs and agencies, conversation on cyber is always far beyond our very focused mandate or issue to discuss. Nevertheless, from my point of view, above all, first committee processes are key. The importance of these processes, as they are under the first committee dealing with international security, peace and international security, is that we all are trying to safeguarding the future by promoting peace and international security, by preventing conflicts in cyberspace, by preventing conflicts itself, and promoting, of course, peaceful uses. From this perspective, from peace and international security, I believe that it is key, and expectations are key also on those first committee and our current discussions on first committee. Also, let me just briefly say that it has been commented by previous speakers, but these processes in general are not new. At least 2 decades ago, the UN adopted a resolution to launch a GGE, a group of governmental experts, to address and to discuss and to recommend on these issues. But what it is really new is the importance, from my point of view, of the agreements and the importance of preventing and countering hostile and unlawful uses of cyberspace. Because the challenges, the threats are more, and they are more, of course, in number, as you know, but they are also more sophisticated, and they target now more countries and institutions than ever. So nowadays, as was said by my colleagues, currently we have 2 processes, and actually facing a UN complex scenario where it is already decided by the General Assembly to initiate a future open-ended working group, and we all still expecting to agree on the future institutional dialogue. For instance, agreeing on establishing a POA, as my dear colleague Henri have presented. Taking into consideration this, if I may say, complex situation, let me share with you some elements to further analyze and to try to build upon on our analysis, taking into account, as I said, the current UN discussion, and considering the way forward or the possibilities of way forward. This I will suggest 5 key elements to take into account. First, implementation. This is not an isolated word or concept, implementation. We do have, right now, previously agreed norms of responsible state behavior. My colleagues have referred to them in very smart manners. So we have them, and the international community is not necessarily familiar to them. We need to implement them, not just to have them, but implement them. By the way, as my colleagues said, Australia and Mexico and many others, interregional composition, have presented to the open-ended working group a proposal on developing a survey, as I see it, as an implementation follow-up mechanism of these norms. We're linking the challenges also and the complications also of implementing the norms with the needs and the opportunities for capacity building. Also, when I refer to implementation, I refer to the applicability, the complete applicability of international law in cyberspace. We do have international law. We do have international law on human rights. We do have international humanitarian law. We do have many other aspects related to cybercrime, related to other legally binding instruments, such as the UNTOC, for instance, and many others. So we do have a very complete, if I may say, international law, which can and must be implemented in cyberspace. So when our narrative, national narrative, we find this call for the applicability of international law in cyberspace, we are asking for the complete implementation of the international law developed for other domains to the cyberspace. The second element I want to share with you is the idea or the concept of complementarity. We need to call for complementarity. First, complementarity of the process itself. Right now, we have focused on norms, the importance of the norms and the implementation and the importance of implementing those norms. But we do have also in the process many important developments on confidence building measures, CBMs, on identifying threats, challenges, on modeling the capacity building track, and on further implementing international law in cyberspace. So it is important to me to focus also on the complementarity of the process itself, linking all these elements, identifying threats, developments on CBMs, capacity building, international law as a whole, not in separate or not giving only the importance to one of each element. Also, the call for complementarity is to call for complementarity of these issues regarding their policy, technical, and diplomatic levels. These levels are nowadays complementary. I mean, when we address the issues of norms or CBMs, we are talking about, of course, on a policy level. But at the same time, when implementing all these developments, we need to talk about a technical level. And then, of course, spreading the information and the implementation and giving information of our implementation through the UN channel, we are talking also about a diplomatic level. So all of these levels, policy, technical, and diplomatic, and by the way, I sincerely congratulate all of us because we all have collocated the diplomatic discussion exactly in the same level as the policy or technical levels. So these all levels are also need to engage and to link and to find the complementarity among them. The third element is the ownership of the processes, the ownership of these discussions, of these elements. Perhaps some years ago, it was very usual to hear from our colleagues when discussing this that these kind of discussions were not necessarily developing countries discussions, or were not necessarily other multi-stakeholders discussion, but only big players, only very powerful countries, etc., etc. We have to say that nowadays we are trying to spread the ownership of this process. And I mean not only to raising awareness. Actually, we have been successful all together in raising awareness of these issues, but to increasing the strategic view of the multiple impacts of this discussion to the whole international agenda, and particularly their impacts not only for states. I mean, they are member states, UN governments processes, of course, but our discussions have concrete impacts and multiple impacts on the private sector, on the service providers, on the civil society organizations, on the academia, on the researchers, etc., etc., etc. And actually on the citizen because of their integrity when working, when developing in the digital domain. So we need to remain convinced that these processes, the ownership of these processes, are of all of us. I mean, we are owners. Each of us, even multi-stakeholders, are owners of these processes. For me and for the priorities of Mexico, it is important to remain convinced that multilateral platform holds the best way to address a discussion in the international community in this regard. And we have to be able to assure with a long-term vision the legitimate and peaceful uses of cyberspace, the resilience in the digital environment, and the realization of the possibilities of information technologies to be used as enablers for sustainable development. And we can do all this from the multilateral platform. That is our approach. These last elements bring me to the fourth consideration to share with you, which is balance, the idea of balance. We need, and perhaps it's a goal, but also from a realistic approach, we do need to work always taking into consideration a balance when discussing this and when agreeing on these issues. A balance between security concerns. As we have said, we are mainly dedicated to prevent conflicts, to promote peace. So security concerns are key and we are working on them. But not because we prioritize or focus on security, we have to forget or to take out all those discussions and elements regarding development. Digital technologies, cyberspace itself is an enabler of development or to development. Of course, technologies give us the opportunity to bridge gaps, to universalize the peaceful uses of these platforms and technologies. And when addressing international security and peace, we also need to bridge those gaps and then to address and to discuss those elements of developments related to security. And the third element to take into account when balancing this discussion is, of course, the element of rights, the human rights, and actually the protection, the promotion of rights and human rights in these platforms and through these technologies. we need to guarantee through our discussion of insecurity and development also the protection and the promotion of those rights and privacy and those elements that we guarantee member states in all domains. We do need to bring them to the cyber domain also. And because of the time, the final element that I want to share with you, and actually have been mentioned a couple of times by my colleagues, is the regional consideration of these elements. We do have UN processes, which is key, which is really good, and where we need to do our best to deliver. But also we are discussing at the regional level. And many developments and many advancements on CBMs, on implementing norms have been materialized, have been concretized from regional perspectives. So we do need to keep in mind that when discussing at the international level, we still discuss at regional level. And we can implement through our regional developments and organizations those international discussions, or bringing to the international discussion those elements discussed, agreed, or concerns coming from the regional level. So it's a two-way track that we need to keep open and to keep very alive when discussing and when ensuring the institutional dialogue for these elements from the UN and taking into consideration all what we have said. I will let here and thanks again for the opportunity to share with you these considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac, for these important points. And also from the Northern Europe, when it's getting dark, it's very nice to see that there is a sun shining somewhere. So that's very good. There are questions coming in. I don't dare to ask the first one that relates to whether the locking mechanism of Henri's door is connected to the French nuclear deterrence, as some of the listeners are afraid. But instead, I think, and this is a true question that has come through, I think there are two big questions. I will read them, and I would propose that, the first is about the EU has put all its cyber diplomacy eggs in the POA basket in the new EU cybersecurity strategy. What will the EU pursue to support global cyber capacity building if there is no consensus on the POA at the March open-ended working group? I think that would be, because it's EU question, I think Henri would be, I'll give it to the Henri, and then I'll try to feel responsibility from EU. At the same time, I'll give the question to Joanna and Isaac. It is another big question. It is how do large-scale cyber events such as SolarWinds intrusion and the exfiltration of 5.2 million guest records from Marriott International, among other key events in recent years, shape the diplomatic discussions, particularly events that may be attributed to a state actor who is also part of the diplomatic discussion? I think this is about the state actors and emergence and how they shape it. So I'll first give the floor to Henri to go on the EU and the POA, and then I can try to say a few words about that. Then Joanna and Isaac on the SolarWinds and the state actors. Henri, please.
Okay, thank you for the question. We have many eggs and many baskets. So if we don't succeed, so I don't speak on behalf of every European countries, and we decide together. But if we don't have a POA at the March meeting, we can continue. We can try to promote the idea unilaterally, or you can promote the idea in the next open-ended working group, and that's not the point. The point is that, again, we consider that we have to increase stability and security. We consider that we cannot make this just with international law and norms. We need concrete cooperation between states. We need to teach and to learn each other. We need to open ourselves to real, serious multi-stakeholderism. We need to encourage private sectors to make progress, to design the product and the contracts differently. And at the end of the day, we will have to make this. So we consider that the POA is a convenient format. We have a lot of supporters. We'll promote both this initiative and this analysis. And I won't stop, whatever happened in March, I won't stop this promotion in April.
Thank you. I'll also reply, also being a part of the EU fold. I think it's very clearly that that the attempt is to bring it back to the consensus. We have had lots of resolutions that have ownership of big players or somebody. I think it would be very useful to have a joint ownership of the cyber process. And I think the POA would be the way to do that. So we would all come together and jointly agree on the POA, not leave some others to set the course of action. I think that's something that is very important. I think the POA doesn't disappear. It will, I hope, grow because it is a practical proposal to go forward on certain issues. The place to decide on the POA ultimately will be at the GA. It's not the open-ended working group issue. So it will need to be, the final arbiter on this issue will be the GA. So when and how we will see, but I think what is important is the attempt to bring the strands together and bring actors together, not to have separate voted resolutions. That's something that as a Finland, as a small country, we do not like. We would like it to be consensual, a consolidated process. And I think the POA provides an opportunity for that. The question was specifically on the capacity building. I do not see that the capacity building ends while we discuss, and I expect the discussion on the POA to continue. Open-ended working group, GGE, first committee. The need for capacity building is obvious, and it will continue. I think EU's commitment to capacity building will not disappear. My take, and this is the Finland's take, and I dare to say many of my EU colleagues agree to it, that the capacity building would be more efficient if we would do it under the auspices of the program of action. We could actually bring consolidate the work that many actors are doing. So those terms, I think it is something that it's a work in progress, and there won't be a kind of sudden miracles and breakthroughs. I think it will go forward. And I was very happy when Henry said that he will continue pushing for it, come what may. I hope this answers the kind of the first question. Then I'll let's give Joanna and then Isaac on the state actors and the SolarWinds. Joanna, please. Sorry, Joanna. Henri raised his finger, so Henri, you are the father of POA. Briefly, I'll give the floor to you.
If I can make briefly 2 comments. First, of course, capacity building will continue, and as you know, a lot of states, even France and UK, for example, have capacity building policies. The United Nations perspective is the opportunity to make a capacity building which is not an influence building policy. And that would be very important, because what we clearly see today is that some countries try to extend the influence, to build influence through capacity building. So we consider that we need an international vision and a collective decision about this. And if I may, because I'm not a career diplomat, I deeply understand the games we are playing in the United Nations and the fact that everyone has to count how many supporters, etc. And it matters. It's not. It matters, but it's just a game. At the end of the day, we have to be sure that we made progress. And sometimes I feel that some countries just count how many supporters, and they try to launch initiative just to have more endorsement than the other. And we have to stop. It's a legacy of the Cold War. It's finished. Let's face the real issues. Sometimes I'm fed up with this. On good faith, we want to protect our countries, our economies, our companies, our citizens. So let's do this. Thank you very much for the two thinkers.
Thank you, Andre. Yes, when the games becomes more important than substance, we are in trouble. I very much agree with you. But Joanna and Isaac now on the SolarWinds and the States. Joanna, please.
Thank you, and thank you for this question. It's a really good question. I think it touches on the question that we often whisper to ourselves. If we're doing all of this work at the UN and we're having all of these discussions, and yet still massive things like SolarWinds happen with increasing frequency, then what is the purpose of the discussions that we're having? And I think for me, this really comes down to the fact that the discussions that we're having, agreeing the rules of what it is that countries should and shouldn't do in cyberspace, is one side of a coin. The other side of that coin is a decision to take action to respond, or if you want to use more direct language, to enforce those rules. So just agreeing things is not sufficient. We also need to take action. And I go back to Jim's comments about an increasing focus on a conversation about consequences. To look very much more specifically at SolarWinds, and I have to stress I'm doing this on the cuff, it's my personal view. When we look at what happened with SolarWinds, and I share this because I think it's a useful way to look at how the framework as a whole applies. So I think the first question is what happened with SolarWinds something that is governed by the framework? Is it espionage? Espionage, for example, is not something that is governed by the framework of international law. Then if we decide that it is something that is within the framework of responsible state behaviour, let's have a look at norms first. I think the norm that would immediately come to mind on this one is do not intentionally cause damage to the critical infrastructure of another state. I think we can definitely tick critical infrastructure. Can we tick, probably we can also tick intentionally. Can we also tick damage? Now, from what I've read, we're talking about infiltration and potentially exfiltration of some information, but has that actually caused damage to that infrastructure? That's a question I don't have enough information to be able to answer it. Then if the norm, other norms that might be applicable is norms like you should not allow your territory to be used to conduct internationally wrongful acts. This norm, for example, is looking at even if you are a state from which this territory is happening, if you have criminal groups in your territory that are responsible for this activity, you as a country have a responsibility here. So it's not purely the norms whilst looking at state behaviour, they're not limited purely to the activity of states. It's also saying as a state you have responsibilities, for example, for proxies and also for criminal actors. Then if we move, that's just two examples of the norms that could be useful in this circumstance. We look at international law. I think probably many of the provisions that I referred to earlier tonight are possibly applicable. Has there been a breach of the territorial sovereignty? Quite possibly, depending on how your country interprets the application of the principle of sovereignty or the rule of sovereignty. Then there's a question of, is this interference in the internal affairs of another state? Maybe. So there is many aspects of this framework that we have agreed that could apply. Certainly, confidence building measures also come in here. So if you have a thought towards the attribution to a particular state, are you triggering, for example, your point of contact networks that allow you to establish communication, to de-escalate from contact, to de-escalate away from conflict, for example. Point of contact networks, exchange of information, all of these types of things really sound very simple, but are so vital when you have a situation that is escalating very, very quickly. Having those confidence building measures in place beforehand really helps us to mitigate and to get things under control. Confidence building measures has a very big role. Capacity building, do you need to improve capacity? I think there's a strong argument in this case that there are capacity gaps to be filled. So that's just a quick run through of the way in which the framework could apply. To go to the other element of the question in terms of countries and making decisions of attributions, it's certainly true that many of the countries and countries that talk a very strong talk about wanting to have a framework of responsible state behaviour, their talk often differs from their walk. And I think attribution is important here. From a technical perspective, attribution is possible. The question then is, what do you do as a country when you make that attribution? The decision on how to act on attribution is a decision that is a very important one. And when we're talking about responses, we need to move beyond the idea that naming and shaming is a sufficient response. We need to look at other responses in our toolkit. Those responses do not need to be in kind. So if you're talking about a SolarWinds compromise, responses might not necessarily be via cyber means. You may look at other options in your toolkit. And the final thing I would say is, when we're talking about responses to malicious activity in cyberspace, responses to malicious activity in cyberspace have the same responses available to a government to respond to malicious activity of any nature. So depending on the severity of the incident, it could be diplomatic action, expulsion of diplomats, for example, could be economic sanctions, it could be, if it's really severe, military action. Of course, it always needs to be calibrated, proportionate and lawful. So I'll stop there, but great question, thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Really walking us through the complexities of analyzing and responding a major case like that. And I think that gives a nutshell what are really the perspectives of cyber diplomacy, because these are really the issues we are grappling. Isaac, please.
Thank you very much for this question. Actually, I will comment in three aspects referred also by Henri and Joanna, and actually by you in very well moderation of this panel, by the way. First, on capacity building and the question of the how to incorporate, how to keep the track on capacity building. I have to refer again that through the current open-ended working group, through the current GGE, and actually from previous agreements, we have found important developments to modeling capacity building exactly from an international approach, from all member states' ownership, not as a way of influencing not as a way of directionating the efforts. From my point of view, through the future P of A or through the future track that we from the UN decide to launch and to keep as a continuation of the dialogue, all these developments on modeling the capacity building from that comprehensive approach will need to be part of them, of the POA or the future open-ended working group. Both. You need this model of capacity building to any effort of future institutional dialogue. Second, on the concretely question of if the situation like the one currently presented by the exploitation of solar wind gives some elements or brings attention of the UN processes, etc. I have to say that not only the current situation presented by the exploitation of solar winds, but any of the and all previous major incidents have in some way influenced us at the UN level in the discussions because they allow us to accelerate some discussions. At the same time, they give us the opportunity to focus on more concrete elements on the negative impacts of this kind of behavior. And of course, they contribute also to make more visible the impacts and the consequences of these incidents and the lessons learned from the recovery and the establishment of the responses for those situations. But I have also to say that this influences not only as member states, but actually we see through the process also implications to private sectors, to service providers, which need to be attended, and we need to pay attention on in order to try to accommodate what is happening in the real world in our diplomatic discussions. And finally, just a brief comment on the elements of attribution and the previous elements said by Henri and Joanna. I sincerely, and remembering the question that was asked to Henri, I see attribution not necessarily the way to the deterrence, and actually I will say to accountability. It is important. Perhaps it's just a concept, but yes, deterrence brings us to a strategic discussion level, strategic discussion where weapons are in front of us, etc. So our preference, our goal must be not necessarily deterrence, but accountability. We have, from the multilateral platform, we have developed many important tools of accountability, for accountability in other domains, in other elements. For instance, the human rights platform, the human rights track to increase transparency, to increase implementation at national level of international agreements, to, in the end, accountability, give us some light of what we can do and what we can accommodate in our cyber discussions. Thanks.
Thanks, Isaac, and thanks for the great points at the end on deterrence. personally I've always been a bit uncomfortable. I think consequences or accountability are much more UN related. I think the deterrence gets us very deep into the disarmament field, mutually assured destruction and all that, which I think we are trying to get away slowly. I think I see, no, I do see that I have a big red clock ahead of me that shows that is a zero, that we have almost overtime. It is a great pleasure with such distinguished colleagues. I thank you all, and it has been a pleasure to listen to you. I hope you have been inspiration to aspiring diplomats. And with that, I hand over to Heli. Thank you.
Thank you, Janne, and thank you all speakers for your very, very good discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really missing our meetings in New York and Geneva, where we could go on with these discussions during the sessions and at the cafes and so on. So hopefully we will be meeting again soon in New York and in Geneva physically. And so far we have to speak in a virtual manner. And my special thanks goes to Johanna, who is up in the middle of night, because in Australia, I believe it's something like 2:30 a.m. So Johanna, we really admire your braveness to endure all these long UN-related meetings. And I'm sorry that our panel also took place in this inhuman hour for you. So thank you so much. And we are now progressing to the next section and our summer school. You see, my mind is in summer all the time when I'm here doing this cyber school, because we started with the summer school that transformed to winter school, and now we are somewhere in the middle of winter in February and doing the school. So the final section of this first day of the winter school is going to talk about the case study on norms implementation. And Miss Elina Noor from Asia Society Policy Institute is going to tell us how the ASEAN countries are implementing cyber norms. We had a cyber norms discussion in the beginning of our training today, and then we progressed with the panel, and now we are asking Elina on practical advice how exactly the nations in ASEAN region have been implementing cyber norms. Elina works as a political security affairs and deputy director. A native from Malaysia, Elina focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance and technology, and preventing violent extremism. In 2017 to 2019, Elina was a member of the Global Commission of the Stability of Cyberspace. She is also on the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs roster of experts supporting efforts to build member states' cyber-related capacity. Welcome, Elina.
Thank you very much.
I will ask a few questions from you, and then we would be very glad to hear from your perspective. And then in the end, maybe 10 minutes or so, we will have, or 10, 15 minutes, we will have the Q&A. So I'll start asking about regional element of implementation of cyber norms. So we have been having those discussions in OSCE, in ASEAN Regional Forum, in ASEAN, and other regions in the world for many years now. And the question always is that how the norms can be implemented and how the countries see international law applying in cyberspace. And my first question for you would be, what are the key barriers to norms implementation, and what are the requirements what the nations should do in order to build resilient cyber infrastructure and to protect critical infrastructure from cyber threats, especially in developing and emerging countries? And also the second question would be, in what way do you see could the development cooperation community be helpful here? And your presentation also leads us to tomorrow's training day, when we are going to talk about international law and capacity building. So the floor is yours, Elina, please.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this kind opportunity. You know, as a Southeast Asian, it's really a privilege to share the ASEAN case study of how the region became an early adopter, even unwitting implementer of the UN 2015 consensus norms on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Let me try to get to your questions, your two questions, by offering 5 points related to ASEAN's cyber norms journey, beginning with an overview, followed by what I call 3 Ps. The Ps are priority, pragmatism, and progression. And I'll conclude with a 5th and final point with an observation on next steps for norms implementation and its implications for capacity building. So hopefully that gets to your 2 questions. Let me start first with an overview to appreciate the context in which ASEAN has progressed. ASEAN, as many ASEAN watchers will know, often comes under heavy criticism for its painfully slow and cumbersome consensus-based approach sometimes. But it's important to step back and consider how much ASEAN member states have collectively and cooperatively within themselves, among themselves, but also with the support and cooperation of dialogue partners from outside the region. Together, all these countries have achieved with regard to cyber issues over the past decade, especially when you consider how diverse the region is. This is, after all, a region of 10 member states with very different political systems, from the monarchical and militarily administered to the democratic and communist. It's a region with different common and civil law systems, different colonial histories and religious traditions, vast economic and digital disparities, with competing domestic priorities set against sometimes very severe resource constraints. And yet, ASEAN was the first region in the developing world to adopt a harmonized legal framework for e-commerce. In 2018, led by Singapore as the ASEAN chair that year, ASEAN member states agreed in principle to the 11 norms of responsible state behavior as laid out in the 2015 GGE consensus report. It was the first regional body to do so. And this was a huge step, especially since only 3 of the 10 ASEAN member states have ever participated in GGE discussions since its inception. And many member states, indeed many states in even other parts of the world, are still struggling to grasp the notion of regulating behavior in cyberspace, whether by way of norms or international law. But, and this is my second point, it became a matter of priority, the first P, because despite the many variances I listed within the ASEAN region, member states have hedged their future on the promise of technology for economic progress and regional integration. I think there was a mention in the last session of not only security, but the importance of the consideration of development in cyberspace. And this is something that the ASEAN region has taken very seriously. If ASEAN had a cyber-related tagline for the last 10 years, it would probably be something along the lines of digital for development. Digitalization, in a sense, has become synonymous with development in the ASEAN region. So in this region, the Twin Digital Development Drive has produced numerous master plans, plans of action, and frameworks related to ICTs, digital connectivity, a smart cities network, personal data protection, e-commerce, all the acronyms that you can think of related to technology, IoT, 4IR, AI. All of these master plans and plans of actions are premised on a secure and stable internet underpinned by a rules-based multilateral order, including norms and the principles of international law. Additionally, because of its strategic location that has resulted in the region bearing the brunt of many great power plays over its long arc of history, ASEAN states well understand the importance of clear rules applied equally to all with mutual respect for sovereignty, even in cyberspace. And you saw this underlined in the ASEAN leaders' statement on cyberspace cooperation in 2018. Understood this way, as a matter of pragmatism, which is my third point, it made sense in 2018, therefore, for ASEAN member states to subscribe to the 11 norms of the 2015 consensus document. The chairman's statement of the 32nd ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity noted that in light of the region's burgeoning digital economy and increasingly interconnected societies, and I'm quoting here, participants reaffirmed the importance of a rules-based cyberspace as an enabler of economic progress and betterment of living standards, and agreed in principle that international law, voluntary and non-binding norms of state behavior, and practical confidence-building measures were essential for stability and predictability in cyberspace. This, therefore, was a logical next step which aligned with ASEAN's own priorities and progress over the years. And this is my fourth point, which is of progression. There was already precedence in the ASEAN framework prior to 2015 that lay the foundation for this endorsement by all 10 ASEAN member states in 2018. Signing on to the 11 norms was not jumping into the unknown simply because the norms dealt with cyberspace. A number of the norms were already in place or being operationalized in the ASEAN system without being specifically labeled norms of responsible state behavior. These norms could therefore be easily transposed to cyberspace. The first norm of the 2015 GGE report urges cooperation in the use of ICTs that are consistent with the purposes of the UN, including to maintain international peace and security. Well, ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, for example, which was signed back in the 70s, which all ASEAN member states and ASEAN's dialogue partners sign on to, underscores the promotion of, quote, active cooperation in the economic, social, technical, scientific, and administrative fields, as well as in matters of common ideals and aspirations of international peace and stability in the region. So there are very strong echoes that were already resonating within the region that were echoed in the 2015 consensus document. Another example, there are 3 norms, right, as we know from the 2015 GGE document that are related to critical infrastructure protection. These are outlined in paragraphs 13F through H. Well, ASEAN has a CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team Incident Drill. Its acronym is ACID. Probably not very appealing, but that's how it goes by, its acronym, ACID. This incident drill has been applicable and in operation in the ASEAN region to critical infrastructure protection cooperation since 2006. These drills have been complemented by individual member state drills, such as in my own country of Malaysia, involving both the public and private sector stakeholders of all the critical infrastructure pillars of Malaysia. Other long-standing and pre-existing examples of critical infrastructure protection cooperation in ASEAN include the ASEAN Cyber Capacity Program, launched in 2016 under the leadership of Singapore, the 2017 ASEAN Direct Communications Infrastructure, covering secure voice and fax communication under the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Framework, as well as the Japan-ASEAN Cyber Defense Exercise with Recurrence, or the Japan-ASEAN CYDER. So there has been cooperation, again, amongst the ASEAN member states, but also with the support of its dialogue partners, such as Japan, such as Australia, the United States, etc., etc. Additionally, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which comprises the 10 ASEAN member states plus 17 other countries, has long debated the security in and the use of ICTs as it's phrased within the ARF context. Its agenda has consistently covered exchange, cooperation, and confidence-building mechanisms, such as the establishment of a points of contact directory, the sharing of information on national laws, policies, best practices, and strategies, the protection of critical infrastructure and consultation mechanisms, awareness raising and information sharing on emergency responses to security incidents in the use of ICTs, and many others. The ARF has also held intersessional meetings on the security in and use of ICTs. And in the past couple of years, its efforts have been complemented and supported at the second track by CSCAP, the Council of Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific Study Group discussions on international law and cyberspace. The point here is that there was already a normative framework in place in ASEAN with its dialogue partners outside of the immediate ASEAN region, applicable to cyberspace for many years prior to 2015. And so endorsing the 11 norms was simply a natural progression of past precedents. The next step for ASEAN, as announced last year in 2020, is the development of a norms implementation checklist that will build on the norms that the ASEAN member states developed in 2019. This checklist will refine the norms chart and make it applicable for a wider range of UN member states as part of ASEAN's commitment to implement the 11 norms of the 2015 report. Finally, let me offer a reflection of some of the real work that lies ahead for ASEAN and its implications for norms implementation as well as capacity building. Cyber norms can be a tricky discussion, but as I hope I've outlined, they're actually not as foreign or onerous to the ASEAN landscape as sometimes perceived. It may simply be a difference of terminology in some instances. The challenge ahead will be to try to consolidate the region's views and interpretations of these norms in a concrete manner at global forums such as the UN in a meaningful and effective way. It will require a view of whether ASEAN, for example, should impose consequences for wrongdoings in cyberspace. Jim Lewis brought this up earlier, and Johanna Weaver also reiterated this point. And this will be a very difficult discussion for ASEAN, given how uncomfortable the grouping usually is with regards to matters of political sensitivity, even outside the cyber realm. The very idea of imposing costs or consequences for norms transgressions presupposes politics and power. Who imposes costs on the powerful, for example? Smaller countries in ASEAN know the answer all too well. If most cyber operations take place at a low, disruptive level in times of peace, what kinds of threshold would compel ASEAN states to take action? Viewed another way, one might ask, how might ASEAN states ensure norms compliance? If large-scale advanced persistent threats have second and third order effects, resulting in physical damage or destruction 1, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, how would states distinguish between espionage and a threat or use of force, or even an armed attack that would then grant states the right to respond? If a state defends forward against the critical infrastructure of an ASEAN member state that somehow ends up being compromised by another state, what recourses to action might be available to that ASEAN member state, since the norms of responsible state behavior would have arguably then been transgressed? These are all big concepts, big questions, but with very real consequences. They may not similarly be understood across all jurisdictions because of the diversity of the region, as I outlined earlier. They may not even resonate the same way given differences in language. The suggestion often proposed is the importance of capacity building in supporting the foundation or the enhancement of technical, policy, and legal knowledge for states in developing or emerging regions to address these difficult questions. That has proven to be helpful, yes, and will continue to be very helpful when done with expansive, not just sufficient, but expansive coordination with local partners to organically support the growth and assertion of local perspectives rather than to graft on agendas and interests from elsewhere in the process. We should not, for example, assume that even when we are speaking the same language, we mean the same thing. And we should perhaps disabuse ourselves of the notion that English, let alone legal terminology, is translated and understood the same way in different countries, given variances in historical legacies, cultures, and lived experiences. With its focus on economic levels of technology, its market size, 650 million people in ASEAN, and its location, the ASEAN region is a prime area for geotechnological contestation. It's therefore imperative that ASEAN countries are able to independently decide their own positions on how a rules-based framework comprising norms and international law should apply in cyberspace. Many of our domestic legal systems in the region are a legacy of our colonial past, and it's critical that ASEAN member states reflect on how, for example, the issue of whether sovereignty is a rule or principle in international law should be unpacked within our own historical and legal context, but with a view to a dynamic future in which ASEAN expects to play more of an active part in. The practice of norms, conformity, and international law, after all, if we're honest, is an interplay of not just rules and policies, but also politics and raw power. The UN cyber norms processes in the GGE and the OEWG have been extremely beneficial in allowing all the ASEAN member states a peek into how these factors will play out in the near future. Another constructive way ahead for ASEAN would be for an increased exchange of inter-regional practices, particularly from and amongst the global south, given the many similarities in priorities, needs, and resource capacity among these countries. So let me stop here. There was a lot of examples, a lot of acronyms. Let me stop here for reactions, comments, and questions. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Elina. I think what we really need is the perspectives from other regions and also how the acceptance of norms that we have agreed globally is progressing in different regions. So your insights were very, very helpful. I have been pondering for a long time, how to implement the norms properly, and sometimes I think that it is lack of capabilities maybe, or lack of maybe technical or organizational knowledge how cyberspace should be defended. But then also the other factor, what I think is important, is lack of awareness that we have these norms already for cyberspace, and we just have to implement those norms. Or there are ways to implement the international law, but it's not well known how. So what do you think? Is it a capacity issue or is it the awareness issue? Where would you place yourself in that, I don't know, dichotomy, or if it's dichotomy at all? Maybe there are triangles there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's both. It's awareness and capacity. And I think sometimes I referred to the idea of framing earlier in my remarks. And I think it's very important to, when trying to socialize the idea of norms, how important they are, how important their implementation is, particularly to smaller states like ours in the ASEAN region, to promote this idea that norms are not foreign, that in fact, people in the region have been adhering or striving to adhere to these norms just outside of the cyber context. And these norms, as I mentioned earlier, are actually easily transposed to the cyber realm. So I think the awareness and recognition that norms are not foreign, that they are essentially common sense of decent, responsible behavior, is something to promote awareness of, and perhaps we, whether states or non-state stakeholders, need to do a better job of explaining the framing and the narrative that way. The second point, of course, as you mentioned, Ambassador, is that of capacity. And sometimes it is not a lack of capacity, but it is a difference in capacity. I mentioned as well the idea that sometimes when we refer to specific terms, phrases, or terminology, they resonate in very different ways in different countries because of our differences in language, but also in our historical past. And so trying to get at what specific terms mean for different countries is really important to promote the inclusion and diversity that we are seeking in international discussions when it comes to capacity. It also helps to convey a more specific and tailored ask when capacity building initiatives are offered from outside the country or the region in particular, in this case, ASEAN. So for example, if there are capacity building initiatives that are meant for a country like Laos, for example, it would be very helpful to know how specific terms translate into or are interpreted by local Laotians in their own language so that they can identify with and claim ownership and a stake in these very terms that will help promote norms implementation and their understanding of how important norms are at international discussions. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. We are now embarking on a very responsibly difficult year in the United Nations First Committee in a way that we have to find a way of how we are going to progress with our discussions on cyber. And we have identified a program of action as a very good way forward, as you have heard from a previous panelist. So, and the program of action has all these elements of practicalities there that would bring the a bit hollow terms of norms that very few countries maybe so far have started to understand and implement. So it would be bring them closer to the global community and also to the global south. So what would be your maybe major recommendations how to start this process? So should we start with the governments only? Or should we also encompass the multi-stakeholder community in the developing nations, I mean? Or should it be something which is more multi-stakeholder together with the private sector and the governments? This could be then growing somehow more organically, because what we want, of course, to do always is to make sure that with every capacity building program or project, we are able to also reach all the recipients and targets who are going to be responsible for these kind of activities in the future. And this kind of resilience building has to be also sustainable. So, and what also we have learned from the past are the mistakes of capacity building, so that the usual mistake being that different donors are going to find one entity in one country where people speak English and are very receptive to the activities there. And in the end, the donor coordination maybe could be better, and also the understanding of realities in the regions could be better on the donor side, and all the efforts and all the resources should be spread better. So what would you advise us? So what is the good way to go forward in your region, and what kind of entry points you suggest, and maybe based on the regional characteristics, what to avoid as well?
Wow, those are huge questions, and I don't want to be presumptuous to give anyone any advice, but maybe some of my own thoughts. I think it's really important, again, to socialize the idea of norms and how capacity building can help. And I think a good way of doing this is for it not just to be government led alone, but for governments in the region to consult with other stakeholders, including the private sector, as well as civil society organizations. And I say this because what we find in the ASEAN region is a very concerted focus on development and economics as a way to leverage technology. So we don't hear very much discussion on security. And this is quite characteristic of the ASEAN region. We tend to shy away from sensitive discussions of politics and security. And a circuitous but practical way of getting to a discussion like cyber norms is to frame it in economic and development terms. Now, sometimes this doesn't resonate very well at the global stage, but it is a priority that ASEAN member states are very keen on. And so in order for ASEAN member states to effectively convey their messaging at the international level, there needs to be a consolidation of views within individual member states before being raised to the regional level. And I think that the region, under the leadership of primarily Singapore, has done a really encouraging job over the last 2-3 years of trying to spark more discussion on this very issue. So at the individual member state level, it's important to involve regulators, but also sometimes we don't often think of economists as a way of enriching the discussion, bringing in economists, but also the younger generation, because they will be the main stakeholders of this discussion and the eventual framework that concretizes later on. I say economists because, again, I get back to this idea of development being a real driver of all sorts of digital efforts and discussions in the region. And very often the issue of how economics plays into cyber norms is very divorced from the discussions that we in our circles are used to, so cyber diplomacy, but not taking into account some of the economic discussions and considerations that are taking place on the ground in Southeast Asia. They're very segmented, very siloed discussions. And we need to bring all these different perspectives in to get a fuller picture of the priorities in ASEAN as needed by its people and its beneficiaries, so that we can craft a more holistic capacity building strategy that we can then begin to pitch to donors, so that capacity building initiatives are actually meaningful and significant in a practical way for ASEAN member states on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Elina. It was very insightful. We have also some questions from the floor, and I think one question here is quite relevant to our discussion, which is that how the individual ASEAN member states have contributed to the development of cyber norms. I think it requires some maybe knowledge how many of the ASEAN members have been part of the GGs before, but we can look it also up in the internet, but maybe you could comment this.
Yeah, so I mentioned in my remarks that there have only been 3 ASEAN member states that have participated in UNGGE discussions, and they've been Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So these are, the larger and more advanced member states in ASEAN. The smaller and perhaps less digitally advanced member states in the region have not yet had the opportunity to participate in UNGGE meetings, but the OEWG really democratized that process, and I think it helped a great deal to socialize some of these discussions and sparked some consideration of how the region as a whole might move forward. In terms of how the region in general has contributed to the norms discussion and framework, I think I mentioned that we have in ASEAN the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. If you look at our official documents in the region, it's all about international peace and security and stability and cooperation and working with everyone, being friends with everyone. And as general as that may seem, I think it's contributed to some of the approaches that have been taken, not just in the GGE discussions, but also at the OEWG discussions through statements from ASEAN member countries individually, but also through other groupings, such as the non-aligned movement. So it's helped to promote ASEAN's own priorities to this norms framework discussion. And so it also, as I mentioned, helped with trying to help folks on the ground understand, the officials in ASEAN capitals understand that norms are not just a foreign imposition. It's something that we have actually been working on within the region and have contributed to in a small way at international discussions on cyber norms.
Thank you, Elina. And with your presentation today, we are wrapping up. And thank you, all excellent speakers and everyone who has joined us today at the Tallinn Winter School of Cyber Diplomacy. And we hope that this day has given you an excellent crash course on the key issues of cyber diplomacy. Tomorrow, we are going to discuss the application of international law and capacity building, which are in the center of our discussions everywhere in both global and regional organizations when we discuss cyber diplomacy issues. Tomorrow we will begin at 2 p.m. or 1400 Central European Time with a keynote intervention by Ambassador Jürg Lauber, chair of the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Developments in the Field of Information and Telecommunications in the Context of International Security. Then we will have the lawyers panel, and then we will have the global leaders of capacity building telling us what are the requirements and challenges in this field. And we will wrap up with a case study on how to build resilient cyber system at national level. See you tomorrow.